Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Hoosier National Forest, deep in the Charles C. Deem Wilderness area of southern Indiana, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my best friend, Brandon Edwards. I should have known something was wrong from the moment we crossed the tree line at Hickory Ridge Trail. The forest felt different that October morning. Too quiet, like nature itself was holding its breath. Brandon, ever the optimist, brushed off my concerns with his usual grin and a joke about city boys getting spooked by a few trees. But I'd grown up camping with my grandfather in these very woods, and I knew when something was off. The plan was straightforward. Hike 15 miles into the wilderness, set up camp near the old Monroe Reservoir spillway, and spend 2 nights under the stars before heading back. Brandon had been going through a rough divorce, and I thought the isolation would do him good. We both needed to disconnect from the constant buzz of Indianapolis to remember what silence sounded like. Our first mistake was trusting the GPS. 3 hours in, the device started glitching. The screen would flicker between our location and coordinates that placed us hundreds of miles away, sometimes showing us in the middle of Lake Michigan. Brandon laughed it off, saying technology never worked right in the sticks, but when my backup GPS did the same thing and our phones lost signal entirely despite showing full bars, the humor died on his lips. "Probably just the atmosphere," he said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "Solar flares or something." I pulled out the paper map I'd printed before we left, but the familiar trails seemed different than I remembered. Paths that should have connected didn't match the topography around us. Hickory Ridge Trail, which I'd hiked dozens of times, appeared to fork where no fork should exist. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Brandon suggested, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool autumn air. But I knew we hadn't. I'd been following the white blazes painted on the trees, just like my grandfather taught me. The problem was that some of the blazes looked wrong, too fresh, as if someone had painted them recently. Others were so faded they seemed ancient, older than the trail system itself. By afternoon, we were lost. The woods around us grew denser as we walked, the canopy thickening until only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and our breath began to mist, despite the weather forecast promising mild temperatures. Fallen leaves crunched under our boots with a sound that seemed too loud, too sharp, echoing in ways that made no sense. "There," Brandon pointed ahead to a small clearing. "We can set up camp there and figure this out tomorrow." The clearing felt wrong the moment we entered it. Perfect circle, about 30 feet across, with grass that was too green for October and soil that looked freshly turned. But we were tired, our packs heavy, and dusk was approaching faster than it should have been. As we set up our tent, I noticed the trees surrounding the clearing were all the same species, white oak, arranged in an almost perfect ring. That wasn't natural. Forests in Indiana were mixed hardwood, not monocultures, and the bark on every tree bore deep scratches, as if something with claws had marked its territory. "Hey, Mike," Brandon called from where he was gathering firewood at the clearing's edge. "Come look at this." He was crouched beside a pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, 7 rocks in a circle, with a larger stone in the center. Symbols were carved into each rock, symbols that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't focusing on them. "Probably just some kids messing around," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. Brandon touched one of the stones, and I swear the temperature dropped another 10 degrees in an instant. His hand jerked back as if he'd been burned, and he stared at his fingertip where a thin line of blood had appeared. "Sharp edges," he muttered, but I'd seen what happened. The stone had drawn blood without him pressing hard enough to cut himself. That night, our fire wouldn't catch properly. We'd brought seasoned hardwood and quality kindling, but the flames sputtered and struggled. producing more smoke than light. When they did burn, they flickered between normal orange and an unsettling blue-white that made our faces look corpse-pale. The sounds started around midnight. At first, it was just rustling in the underbrush beyond our clearing, small sounds that could have been raccoons or possums. But then came the whistling. Not wind through the trees, but deliberate melodic whistling that circled our campsite in a slow, measured pace. The tune was familiar, but wrong, like a childhood lullaby played in a minor key. "You hear that?" Brandon whispered from his sleeping bag. I nodded, afraid to speak. The whistling was getting closer, though I couldn't see anyone in the darkness beyond our feeble fire. Every few minutes it would stop, and in those moments of silence I could swear I heard breathing, deep, labored breathing like someone who'd been running for miles. Then came the voice. Michael. Brandon. It called our names in a sing-song tone, like a mother calling children in for dinner. But the voice was wrong. Too deep, with an odd resonance that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. How does it know our names? Brandon's whisper was barely audible. Before I could answer, something crashed through the underbrush at the far edge of the clearing. Branches snapped with sounds like gunshots, and whatever was moving out there was big. The fire flickered lower, as if something was sucking the oxygen away. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam toward the sound. For just an instant, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving between the trees, too tall to be human, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Then it was gone, leaving only the smell of decay and copper pennies. We didn't sleep that night. Morning brought no relief. Our packs, which we'd secured near the tent, were scattered across the clearing. Food containers were opened but not eaten from. The contents just spread around as if something had been searching for something specific. Worse, our compass spun wildly in every direction, never settling on magnetic north. "We need to get out of here," I said, checking our remaining supplies. Brandon nodded, but when we tried to leave the clearing, we couldn't find the trail we'd used to enter. Every direction looked the same, dense forest with no clear path. The white blazes that had guided us here were nowhere to be seen. We picked a direction that felt right and started walking. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. The forest remained uniform, unchanging, as if we were walking in place. Worse, I began to notice we were seeing the same landmarks repeatedly. A distinctive lightning-struck oak, a boulder shaped like a crouching bear, a fallen log covered in bright orange fungus. We were walking in circles, though our compass insisted we were traveling in a straight line. "This is impossible," Brandon said, his voice tight with panic. "Forests don't work this way." But I was beginning to suspect we weren't in an ordinary forest anymore. Around noon, we heard chopping sounds, rhythmic, like someone splitting wood with an axe. Hope flared in my chest. Another camper, maybe someone who could point us toward the main trail. We followed the sound for what felt like hours, always seeming to get closer but never quite reaching its source. That's when Brandon started acting strange. At first, it was little things. He'd stop walking without warning and stand perfectly still, head tilted like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. When I'd ask what was wrong, he'd blink rapidly and smile, but it wasn't his smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Just thought I heard something," he'd say, but his voice had developed an odd cadence like he was having trouble remembering how to form words. By mid-afternoon, I was genuinely worried about my friend. He'd grown pale, almost translucent, and dark circles had appeared under his eyes as if he hadn't slept in days. His movements became jerky, puppet-like, and he'd forgotten simple things, like my middle name, or the name of his soon-to-be ex-wife, or what city we lived in. "You feeling okay, Brandon?" I asked during one of our rest stops. He turned to look at me, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. His eyes had developed a glassy, unfocused quality, and when he smiled, I noticed his teeth looked different, sharper, more pointed than they should be. "Never better, Michael," he said in that wrong voice. "Just enjoying the woods. Such beautiful woods. So hungry." The last word came out as barely a whisper, but I heard it clearly. Hungry. Not "I'm hungry" or "getting hungry," just that single, loaded word that made my skin crawl. As the sun began to set, far too early, as if something was pulling it below the horizon, we found ourselves back in the same clearing where we'd camped the night before. Our tent was still there, exactly as we'd left it, though I was certain we'd been walking away from this place all day. "How is this possible?" I demanded, but Brandon wasn't listening. He was staring at the stone circle with an expression of intense concentration, like he was trying to solve a complex puzzle. "They're beautiful," he murmured, approaching the carved stones. "Do you see how they move?" The stones weren't moving, but I didn't contradict him. Something was very wrong with my friend, and I was beginning to suspect it had started the moment he touched that center stone the night before. That evening, I pretended to set up camp while watching Brandon carefully. He sat cross-legged beside the stone circle, perfectly motionless, staring at the symbols carved into the rocks. Occasionally, his lips would move as if he was reading or reciting something, but no sound came out. When darkness fell, I heard the whistling again, but this time I saw where it was coming from. Brandon was making the sound, though his lips weren't pursed and his expression remained blank. The melody emerged from deep in his throat, a harmonic that seemed to resonate in my bones. As he whistled, the symbols on the stones began to glow with a faint, sickly light. "Brandon," I called softly, "what are you doing?" He turned toward me, and in the stone's eerie light I saw that his features had subtly changed. His face was longer, more gaunt, and his fingers had grown visibly longer since that morning. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth had indeed become pointed, not filed, but grown that way, like a predator's. "I'm calling dinner," he said in a voice that was no longer entirely his own. The breathing sounds started again, closer this time. Multiple sources coming from different directions around the clearing. Whatever was out there in the darkness was responding to Brandon's call, drawn by that inhuman whistling. I backed toward the tent, my heart hammering in my chest. "Brandon, we need to leave. Now." "Leave?" He tilted his head at an unnatural angle, like a bird studying an insect. "But they're almost here. They've been so hungry, Michael, so very hungry. And you smell delicious." The things in the darkness began to emerge into the clearing. They might have been human once, but not anymore. Impossibly tall and thin, with elongated limbs and faces that had stretched into something resembling wolves. Their skin was the color of old bone, and their eyes reflected the stone light like an animal's. They moved with jerky, predatory grace, surrounding the clearing in perfect silence. And Brandon, the thing that had been Brandon, stood up to greet them. "Welcome, brothers," he said, his voice now completely inhuman. "I've brought you a gift." I ran. Crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, I ran deeper into the forest with the sound of pursuit close behind. Not just footsteps, but that awful whistling, coming from multiple throats now, echoing through the trees in a discordant symphony. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a massive fallen oak tree. Pressing my back against the trunk, I tried to control my breathing and listen for sounds of pursuit. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, no bird calls. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. I waited in that oppressive quiet for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might draw them to me. That's when I heard Brandon's voice calling from somewhere in the darkness. "Michael! Michael, where are you? I'm hurt. I need help." It was his voice, completely human again, filled with pain and confusion. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe whatever had happened to him was temporary. Maybe he'd fought it off somehow. "Michael, please, something attacked me. I can't see. There's blood everywhere." The voice was coming from my left, maybe 50 yards away. I could hear genuine distress, real fear. It sounded exactly like my friend, the man I'd known for 15 years, the guy who'd been best man at my wedding. I almost went to him. But then I remembered the pointed teeth, the stretched features, the way he'd called those things his brothers. And I realized that whatever was calling to me in Brandon's voice wasn't my friend anymore, if it ever had been. "I know you can hear me, Michael," the voice continued, but now there was an edge to it, a subtle wrongness that confirmed my suspicions. "You can't hide from us forever. We can smell your fear. We can taste your blood on the wind." The voice was moving, circling my position. Others joined it. Multiple Brandons calling my name from different directions, each one trying to lure me out of hiding. I stayed put until dawn. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the canopy, the voices stopped. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by normal forest sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant sound of running water. I waited another hour before emerging from my hiding spot, every nerve screaming with the need to get away from this place. The forest looked different in daylight. Normal. The trees were the mixed hardwood I expected, the undergrowth sparse enough to navigate easily. And there, clearly visible through the morning light, was a trail marked with fresh white blazes. I followed it with desperate hope, and within 2 hours I reached a parking area where a Forest Service truck was parked. 2 rangers were checking trail conditions, and they looked up in surprise as I stumbled out of the woods. "Sir, are you all right?" The older ranger approached me with concern. "You look like you've been through hell." I told them about Brandon, about how we'd gotten separated during the night. I described the clearing with the stone circle, the thing my friend had become, but I kept the supernatural elements to myself. They'd never believe it, and I wasn't sure I believed it myself. They organized a search immediately. Helicopters, tracking dogs, volunteers from the local community. For 3 days, they combed every inch of the Charles C. Deem Wilderness area, but they found no trace of Brandon Edwards, no trace of him, the clearing, or the stone circle. According to the rangers, there was no place in the Hoosier National Forest that matched my description. No perfect circular clearings, no rings of white oak trees, no ancient stone formations. The GPS coordinates I provided led to a swampy area that had been underwater for decades due to beaver activity. The official report concluded that Brandon had suffered some kind of accident or medical emergency, and that my account was likely influenced by dehydration and exhaustion. They suggested that trauma could cause people to remember events that never happened, especially in stressful survival situations. But I know what I saw. I know what Brandon became. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I can still hear whistling outside my apartment window. A familiar tune played in a minor key, calling my name in a voice that sounds almost exactly like my best friend's. I moved to Chicago 6 months later. The whistling followed me there. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph taken from across the street from my building. In the picture, barely visible in an upstairs window, was a pale figure that might have been a man, if men had faces that stretched too long and teeth that caught the light like broken glass. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a message in handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar. "Still hungry, Michael. Still so very hungry." I'm leaving Chicago tomorrow. I don't know where I'll go, but I can't stay here. Because last night, for the first time since the Hoosier National Forest, I heard more than one voice whistling outside my window. They're calling others now, building their pack, and I think they're getting closer. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Brown County State Park, Indiana, deep in the Yellowwood Forest where the autumn mist clings to ancient oak trees like the breath of the dead. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus kept checking his phone every few minutes during the 3-hour drive from Indianapolis. The closer we got to the park, the more agitated he became, running his fingers through his sandy hair and bouncing his leg against the passenger seat. But I was too excited about our annual camping trip to pay much attention to his nervous energy. "You sure you're good with roughing it this year?" I asked as we turned onto the gravel road leading into the deeper sections of the park. We could still book a cabin." Marcus forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Nah, man, I need this. Need to get away from everything." He gestured vaguely at his silent phone. "Besides, camping builds character, right?" In the back seat, Jake Rodriguez was already half asleep against the window, his dark beard pressed against the glass. Our fourth member, Kevin Young, sat beside him reviewing our supply list for the third time, his methodical nature showing even in leisure. We'd been friends since college, though life had scattered us across different careers and cities. This annual trip was sacred to us, a way to reconnect and escape the grinding routine of adult responsibilities. "Turn here," Kevin said, pointing to an unmarked dirt path that branched off from the main trail. According to my research, this leads to some primitive camping spots near Straw Lake. Should be completely isolated. The path wound deeper into the forest, branches scraping against my Jeep like skeletal fingers. The GPS signal had died 20 minutes ago, but Kevin's printed maps seemed reliable enough. The trees grew thicker as we drove, their canopy so dense that even the afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the gloom. We finally reached a small clearing beside the dark waters of Straw Lake. The place felt forgotten by time. No fire rings, no picnic tables, just a circle of grass surrounded by towering trees whose leaves rustled with an almost whispered urgency. The lake stretched into the distance, its surface so still it looked like black glass. "Perfect," I said, killing the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder toward the tree line. His usual easy confidence had evaporated, replaced by something I'd never seen in him before. Fear. "You okay, man?" I asked quietly while Jake and Kevin set up the tents. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool October air. "Yeah, just bad dreams lately. Probably work stress." He managed a weak smile. "Sarah's been on my case about taking this trip. Said I need to confront my issues or some therapy bullshit." I'd met Marcus's girlfriend Sarah a few times. She seemed nice enough, if a bit intense about psychology and self-improvement. "What kind of dreams?" "Doesn't matter." Marcus turned away abruptly. "Let's just focus on having a good time." By sunset, we had camp established and a fire crackling in a ring of stones Kevin had meticulously arranged. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe beyond the reach of the light. Jake had produced a cooler full of beer, and we settled into our familiar rhythm of storytelling and good-natured ribbing. "Remember freshman year when Marcus thought he could impress that girl by climbing the science building?" Jake said, his words slightly slurred from his third beer. "Jenny Morrison," Marcus said with a nostalgic grin. "And I did impress her. Right up until I got stuck on the ledge and campus security had to get me down." We laughed, and for a moment, the oppressive atmosphere of the forest seemed to lift. But as the night deepened, the sounds around us began to change. The normal chirping of crickets and hooting of owls gradually faded, replaced by something else, a low, almost rhythmic clicking that seemed to emanate from the darkness beyond our firelight. "What is that?" Kevin asked, his head tilted toward the tree line. We all listened. The clicking sound came in patterns like Morse code, but wrong somehow. Too deliberate, too intelligent. "Probably just some kind of bug," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus had gone completely rigid, his beer forgotten in his hands. "We should put out the fire." "What? Why?" I asked. It's calling attention to us." Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. "Making us a target." "Target for what?" Kevin demanded. "Marcus, you're freaking us out." The clicking stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. Even the usual night sounds had ceased, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "I think I'll turn in," Marcus said, standing quickly. "Long day tomorrow if we're hiking to those caves Kevin found." He disappeared into his tent, zipping it shut with unnecessary force. The rest of us exchanged glances but eventually followed suit. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I could hear Marcus tossing and turning in the tent next to mine, occasionally muttering in his sleep. I caught fragments. Not my fault. Couldn't save them. It's coming back. I was just drifting off when a new sound jolted me awake. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our camp. But the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, with an odd dragging quality, as if whatever was walking had injured one leg. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps paused directly outside Marcus's tent, and I heard a low sniffing sound, like an animal testing the air. Then, impossibly, I heard Marcus's voice from inside his tent. "It's okay. I know what you want." The footsteps resumed their circuit, and I lay frozen until exhaustion finally claimed me. I woke to find Marcus's tent empty, his sleeping bag unzipped from the inside. His boots were still neatly placed by the tent entrance, but there were no tracks leading away, just the faint impression in the dirt of something large having stood there. "Where the hell is Marcus?" Jake demanded when he emerged from his tent to find me standing by the cold fire pit. Kevin joined us, already dressed and consulting his watch. His truck keys are still here, his phone too. We searched the immediate area, calling his name until our voices echoed off the water. There was no sign of him anywhere, but I kept noticing things that made my skin crawl. Scratches on the trees at about head height, too deep and too regular to be from any animal I knew. A strange, sickly sweet smell that seemed to drift from the deeper forest. And tracks, not human, but not quite animal either, that led from the tree line toward our camp before abruptly stopping. "We need to call for help," Kevin said. But when we tried our phones, they showed no signal despite being in the same location where we'd had at least one bar the day before. "The ranger station," Jake suggested. "We could drive back and get help." But when we tried to leave, my Jeep wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, as if something vital had been removed or disconnected. Kevin, ever practical, popped the hood and immediately cursed. "The distributor cap is missing," he said. "Someone took it." The implications hit us like a physical blow. Someone, or something, had deliberately stranded us here. "Marcus wouldn't do this," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely sure. His behavior the night before had been increasingly erratic. We spent the morning searching in wider circles, but the forest seemed to have swallowed Marcus completely. The trees grew denser as we moved away from the lake, their branches interlocking overhead until we moved through a green twilight even at midday. The air felt thick and oppressive, carrying that same sickly sweet smell that reminded me uncomfortably of rotting meat. It was Jake who found the first real clue, a piece of Marcus's red flannel shirt hanging from a branch about 2 miles from camp. The fabric was torn, with dark stains that could have been blood. The branch it hung from was 12 feet off the ground. "How the hell did it get up there?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. Kevin was studying the ground beneath the tree. "These tracks, they're not right. Look at the spacing between the prints. Whatever made these has legs at least 7 feet long." The tracks were indeed massive, clawed impressions in the soft earth that suggested something both large and predatory. But the most disturbing detail was how they seemed to change as we followed them. Near the tree, they looked almost human. 50 yards deeper into the forest, they had become something else entirely. We returned to camp as the sun began to set, no closer to finding Marcus but considerably more frightened. The forest around us had taken on a malevolent quality, every shadow potentially hiding something dangerous. We built up the fire higher than the night before and sat close together, our conversations subdued. "Maybe we should try walking out," Jake suggested. "Follow the road back to the main park area." "It's over 20 miles, Kevin replied, "and we'd be walking through the forest at night." "Better than sitting here waiting to be picked off one by one," Jake shot back. Before we could decide, we heard it, Marcus's voice calling from the darkness beyond our fire. "Guys! Hey, guys, where are you?" Relief flooded through me so powerfully I almost collapsed. "Marcus, we're here, by the fire." His silhouette appeared at the edge of the firelight and he stumbled into the circle looking disheveled but unharmed. His clothes were dirty and torn and he moved with an odd, stiff gait, but he was alive. "Jesus Christ, man, where have you been?" Jake demanded, jumping up to embrace him. Marcus didn't return the hug, standing rigid in Jake's arms. I got lost. Went for a walk this morning and couldn't find my way back. Been wandering around all day. Something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. His face was pale, almost gray in the firelight, and his eyes had a strange, unfocused quality. When he spoke, he didn't quite look at any of us directly. "You went for a walk without your boots?" Kevin asked pointedly. Marcus looked down at his bare feet as if noticing them for the first time. "I must have lost them somewhere." "Your tent was empty when we woke up," I said. "We've been searching for you since dawn." "Sorry," Marcus said, but there was no emotion in his voice. "I should have left a note." He sat down by the fire, but something about his posture was wrong. He held himself too straight, too still, like someone consciously trying to appear normal. And when Jake offered him a beer, Marcus stared at it for a long moment as if he'd never seen such a thing before. "I'm not thirsty," he said finally. "Dude, you've been lost in the woods all day. You must be dehydrated." I said I'm not thirsty. The sharpness in Marcus's voice made us all look at him. He was smiling, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. As the night wore on, Marcus's behavior became increasingly disturbing. He rarely spoke unless directly addressed, and when he did, his responses were often delayed, as if he had to think carefully about what a normal person would say. He never blinked, just stared into the fire with that unnaturally wide smile. Most unsettling of all was the way he smelled. Beneath the expected odor of dirt and sweat was that same sickly sweet scent we'd noticed in the forest, now so strong it made my stomach turn. "I'm going to get some sleep," Kevin announced around midnight, clearly as unnerved as the rest of us. "Good idea," Marcus said immediately, his smile growing wider. "We should all sleep, get our rest." There was something in the way he said it, an eagerness that made my skin crawl. I caught Jake's eye and saw my own suspicion reflected there. "Actually, I think I'll stay up and keep the fire going," I said. "Make sure it doesn't die out." Marcus's smile flickered for just a moment. "That's not necessary. The fire will be fine." "I don't mind," I insisted. "I'm not that tired anyway." Kevin looked between us, sensing the tension. "I'll stay up too. Keep you company. And me," Jake added quickly. Marcus's facade finally cracked. The smile fell away, and when he looked at us, his eyes held a cold intelligence that was utterly alien. "You should sleep," he said, and his voice carried an undertone that seemed to resonate in my bones. "Sleep now." The compulsion hit me like a physical weight. My eyelids grew heavy and my thoughts became sluggish. Beside me, I could see Kevin and Jake swaying, their eyes glazing over. But fear proved stronger than whatever power Marcus was wielding. The wrongness of the situation, the wrongness of Marcus himself, sent adrenaline coursing through my system, burning away the unnatural drowsiness. "You're not Marcus," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The thing wearing my friend's face tilted its head with a curious expression. "Of course I am. Who else would I be?" "Marcus never calls it the fire," I said, standing slowly. "He always says, 'our fire,' or 'the campfire.' And he's been afraid of the dark since his accident in college. He would never volunteer to let it die out." The creature's stolen face stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "Clever, but not clever enough." It moved with inhuman speed, lunging across the fire pit toward me. I threw myself backward, crashing into Kevin and jarring him from the creature's influence. Jake snapped out of it a second later as the thing that had been Marcus landed where I'd been sitting. In the firelight, I could see its true form flickering in and out of focus. Sometimes Marcus, sometimes something tall and emaciated with limbs that bent in too many places. Its skin looked like bark, and when it opened its mouth, I could see down its throat to something that definitely wasn't human anatomy. "Wendigo," Kevin gasped, the word barely audible. The The creature's head snapped toward him with predatory focus. "You know what I am. Good. That will make this more interesting." It moved toward Kevin with that same unsettling speed, but Jake was faster, grabbing a burning log from the fire and swinging it like a club. The flame struck the creature in the chest and it let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal. "The fire!" I shouted. "It doesn't like the fire!" We grabbed more burning branches, forming a protective circle as the wendigo retreated to the edge of the light. It paced there like a caged animal, sometimes wearing Marcus's face and sometimes showing us glimpses of its true form, all sinew and bone and terrible hunger. "Where is he?" I demanded. "Where's the real Marcus?" The creature laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. He invited me in, opened the door wide with his guilt and self-loathing. "Did you know he killed someone? A little girl, 3 months ago. Drunk, driving." My blood turned to ice. Marcus had been acting strangely for months, but he'd never said anything about an accident. "He's been feeding me his remorse," the wendigo continued, its voice shifting between Marcus's familiar tone and something inhuman. Such exquisite anguish. "But now I'm hungry for more substantial fare." It lunged again, and this time it nearly reached Jake before he could drive it back with his burning branch. We were trapped, and the fire was burning lower despite our efforts to keep it fed. "The truck," Kevin said urgently. "If we can get to the truck." "It's broken," I reminded him. "The distributor cap. I saw where it landed when I checked the engine. If I can get to it." It was a desperate plan, but our only option. The wendigo seemed content to wait us out, knowing that eventually our fuel would run low and we'd be defenseless. "I'll make a run for it," Kevin said. "Keep it distracted." Before any of us could object, he sprinted toward the Jeep. The wendigo reacted instantly, flowing across the ground in pursuit with a motion that was more glide than run. I chased after it, swinging my burning branch at its elongated form. The creature whirled on me with a snarl, and I found myself staring into Marcus's face again, but wrong, so terribly wrong. His features were stretched and distorted, his skin gray and mottled. When he spoke, Marcus's voice was layered with another, deeper tone. "Daniel, help me." For a moment I hesitated. Was there still something of my friend trapped inside this thing? But then I saw its eyes, empty black pits that held nothing human, and I knew better. I drove the burning log into its chest with all my strength. The wendigo screamed and staggered backward, giving Kevin the seconds he needed to reach the truck and pop the hood. "Got it!" Kevin shouted, holding up the missing distributor cap. Jake and I ran for the vehicle as Kevin worked frantically under the hood. Behind us, the wendigo was already recovering, its burned flesh knitting itself back together with nauseating efficiency. Come on," Kevin muttered, his hands shaking as he tried to reattach the component in the dark. The wendigo reached the truck just as the engine roared to life. I threw myself into the driver's seat while Jake and Kevin piled into the back. Through the windshield, I could see the creature's face pressed against the glass. Marcus's face, but elongated and distorted, his mouth open in a silent scream. I gunned the engine and the truck lurched forward, throwing the wendigo aside. It rolled across the ground with impossible agility and gave chase, its form shifting and flowing as it ran. In my rearview mirror, I watched it alternate between Marcus's familiar shape and something that looked like a twisted tree come to life. The dirt road was treacherous in the dark, full of ruts and rocks that threatened to overturn us, but I didn't dare slow down. The wendigo kept pace effortlessly, sometimes running alongside us through the trees, sometimes ahead of us, sometimes behind. It was playing with us, I realized. It could have stopped the truck at any time. "Why isn't it attacking?" Jake panted from the back seat. Kevin had his phone out, desperately checking for signal. "Maybe it can't leave its territory. Maybe we just have to get far enough away." But as we reached the main road leading out of the park, the wendigo suddenly appeared directly in front of us. I had no choice but to swerve, and the truck went off the road, crashing through underbrush before slamming into a massive oak tree. The impact threw us around like rag dolls. My head struck the steering wheel and stars exploded across my vision. When my sight cleared, I could taste blood and hear Kevin groaning from the back seat. "Jake," I called. No response. I turned to see Jake slumped against his window, blood trickling from his temple. His chest rose and fell shallowly, but he was unconscious. The wendigo appeared at my shattered driver's side window, and for the first time, it spoke in Marcus's true voice, weak and desperate. "Danny, it's still me. Please." I wanted to believe it. God help me, some part of me wanted to believe that my friend was still in there, fighting to break free, but then I noticed its hands on the window frame. The fingers were too long, ending in yellowed claws, and there were too many joints in each digit. "Let him go," I whispered. The wendigo smiled with Marcus's face. "He doesn't want to go. The guilt is eating him alive. I'm doing him a favor." It reached through the window toward me, and I threw myself across the cab to the passenger side. Kevin was already moving, dragging Jake's unconscious form through the back door. I followed, and we stumbled away from the truck into the forest. "The ranger station," Kevin gasped, supporting Jake's weight. "It can't be more than a few miles if we follow the road." But the wendigo was already there, standing in our path with Marcus's familiar grin. It had stopped pretending to be entirely human now. Its limbs were too long, its torso too thin, and its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a normal person's neck. "You can't run forever," it said in that layered voice, "and I'm so very hungry." We backed away, but it followed, herding us deeper into the forest. Kevin was struggling with Jake's dead weight, and I could see exhaustion taking its toll. We needed shelter, somewhere to make a stand. There, Kevin pointed to a dark shape through the trees. That cabin. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and its roof partially collapsed, but it was better than being caught in the open. We struggled toward it as the wendigo stalked us, sometimes visible, sometimes just a sound in the underbrush. The cabin door was unlocked but warped with age. Kevin and I managed to force it open and drag Jake inside. The interior was pitch black and smelled of mold and decay, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the forest. I barricaded the door with an old table while Kevin found a battery-powered lantern that still worked. The weak light revealed a single room with a stone fireplace and primitive furniture. Newspapers from the 1980s were scattered across a desk, and hunting trophies hung on the walls. Deer heads with empty eye sockets that seemed to watch us in the shifting light. Jake was starting to come around, moaning softly as consciousness returned. Kevin checked his pupils with the lantern. Concussion, but he should be okay. We need to keep him awake. Outside, we could hear the wendigo circling the cabin. Sometimes it scratched at the walls with its claws. Sometimes it called to us in Marcus's voice, begging us to let him in. The sound of Marcus pleading for help was almost worse than the creature's inhuman shrieks. "There has to be a way to kill it," I said, searching through the cabin's sparse contents. Kevin was examining the newspapers. According to these articles, there were strange disappearances in this area going back decades. People vanishing without a trace. Others found changed. I found a locked gun cabinet and managed to break it open with a fire poker. Inside was an old hunting rifle and a box of ammunition. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Iron," Jake mumbled, his eyes finally focusing. "My grandmother told stories. Iron and fire." "The bullets are probably steel," Kevin said, examining the ammunition. "Close enough to iron, maybe." The scratching stopped abruptly, and the silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. I could hear my own heartbeat and Kevin's rapid breathing, but nothing from outside. Then Marcus's voice came from directly above us. "Danny, Kevin, Jake, are you okay in there?" We looked up at the ceiling. Something large was moving across the roof, but the footsteps were wrong. Too many of them, in a pattern that suggested the creature was crawling rather than walking. "We're fine, Marcus," I called back, raising the rifle. "Why don't you come down and we'll talk?" "I can't come down," the voice replied, moving from one side of the roof to the other. "It won't let me. But I'm still me, Danny. I swear I'm still me." Jake struggled to sit up. Ask him about Sarah's cat." "What about Sarah's cat?" I called. There was a long pause. "What cat? Sarah doesn't have a cat." Jake nodded grimly. "Sarah's allergic. Marcus always talks about how she can't have pets. The real Marcus would know that." The scratching resumed, more frantic now. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the creature tried to tear its way through the roof. I aimed the rifle upward and fired. The bullet punched through the rotted wood, and the wendigo let out a shriek that shattered what was left of the cabin's windows. Something large crashed down through the trees outside, and then there was silence. "Did we get it?" Kevin whispered. I crept to the boarded window and peered through a gap in the planks. The forest outside looked empty, but I could see a dark stain on the ground near the cabin that could have been blood. Maybe we should wait until morning before... The door exploded inward, sending the table I'd used to barricade it flying across the room. The wendigo stood in the doorway, and it had abandoned any pretense of humanity. It was easily 8 feet tall, its limbs grotesquely elongated and ending in claws that looked capable of shredding steel. Its skin was the color of bark, mottled with patches of what looked like moss or lichen. But the worst part was its face, still recognizably Marcus, but stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. "Iron hurts," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "But it doesn't kill. Nothing kills hunger like mine." It lunged toward Jake, who was still too weak to move quickly. I fired again, aiming for center mass. The bullet struck its chest and the creature staggered, black blood spraying from the wound, but it didn't go down. Kevin had grabbed the fire poker and was trying to light it from the lantern's flame. The wendigo turned toward him with predatory interest, moving with that fluid, inhuman grace. "The fireplace!" I shouted. "Light the fireplace!" There were old newspapers and kindling still stacked beside the hearth. Kevin dropped to his knees and began building a fire while I kept shooting. Each bullet slowed the creature down but didn't stop it. I was running out of ammunition fast. The kindling caught just as the wendigo reached Kevin. He thrust the burning poker into its face and it reeled backward with another of those metallic shrieks. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, not the normal smell of cooked meat, but something rotten and foul. Fire erupted in the hearth as Kevin fed it newspaper and broken furniture. The wendigo backed away from the growing flames, but we were running out of fuel. The cabin's furnishings wouldn't burn forever. "The walls," Jake gasped. "The cabin. It's old wood. We could burn the whole thing." It was insane, but it might work. I grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the far wall. Fuel splashed across the dry wood and ignited immediately. Kevin did the same with a kerosene lamp from the mantel. The wendigo realized what we were doing and threw itself toward the growing fire, trying to stamp out the flames. But the old wood was tinder dry, and within minutes the entire back wall was ablaze. We retreated toward the door as smoke filled the cabin. The wendigo was trapped between us and the fire, its stolen face contorting with rage and pain. For a moment, I thought I saw Marcus again. Really saw him, not the creature's imitation, but my actual friend, trapped and terrified. "Danny," he whispered, and this time it sounded completely human. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about everything." "Marcus?" "It's feeding on my guilt," he said, tears streaming down his distorted face. "I killed her, Danny. Little Emma Chen. She was only 6 years old." The name hit me like a physical blow. I remembered seeing it in the news, a child killed by a drunk driver who'd fled the scene. The police had never caught whoever did it. "I was drunk," Marcus continued, the wendigo's influence clearly weakening as the fire grew around us. "Coming home from that bar near my apartment. She ran into the street chasing a ball and I didn't even stop. I was too scared." The flames were reaching the ceiling now, and the heat was becoming unbearable. We needed to get out, but Marcus was still standing in the middle of the inferno, seemingly immune to the fire that should have been consuming him. "It's my fault she's dead," he said. "It's my fault this thing exists. It was born from my guilt, Danny. Born from what I did to that little girl." "That doesn't mean you have to die too," I shouted over the roar of the flames. Marcus smiled sadly. "Yes, it does. It's the only way to make this right." The wendigo's true form began to reassert itself, but the fire was weakening it. The creature's bark-like skin was charring and cracking, black blood seeping from the wounds. It looked at us with eyes that held both inhuman hunger and very human despair. "Run," Marcus said with his last bit of control. "Run, and don't look back." We stumbled out of the burning cabin into the cool forest air. Behind us, the structure was fully engulfed, flames reaching 50 feet into the sky. Through the roar of the fire, I could hear the wendigo screaming. Not the metallic shriek it had made before, but something that sounded heartbreakingly human. The three of us made our way back to the road, supporting each other as we walked. Jake's head injury was worse than we'd thought, and Kevin had suffered burns on his hands from building the fire. I wasn't in much better shape, with cuts from the car crash and smoke inhalation that left me gasping with every breath. We'd walked maybe 2 miles when we saw headlights coming toward us. A park ranger's truck pulled over, and a middle-aged woman in uniform got out. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you boys?" she asked, reaching for her radio. "Our friend," I managed to say between coughing fits. "There was an accident. A fire." "We'll get you to a hospital," she said, guiding us toward her truck. "Don't worry about anything else right now." As she radioed for medical assistance, I looked back toward the forest. In the distance, I could still see the glow of the burning cabin against the sky. There was no sign of the wendigo, no indication that anything supernatural had occurred. Just 4 friends camping, and an accident that had cost one of them his life. The official investigation concluded that Marcus had suffered a psychotic break brought on by guilt over the hit-and-run accident 3 months earlier. His confession was found in his journal back at his apartment, along with detailed drawings of the wendigo and extensive research into local folklore about cannibalistic spirits. The authorities assumed he'd started the cabin fire in a suicide attempt after attacking us in his delirium. They found his body in the ashes, burned beyond recognition. The coroner said he would have died quickly from smoke inhalation, which was supposed to be comforting. What they didn't find were any bones that matched his height or build. The remains they recovered belonged to someone, or something, much larger. Jake made a full recovery from his concussion, and Kevin's hands healed with minimal scarring. Physically, we were fine. Mentally was another story. Jake started drinking heavily and quit his job 6 months later. Kevin became obsessed with researching wendigo folklore and disappeared into the Canadian wilderness last spring. I never heard from him again. As for me, I moved to Arizona. Desert seemed like the safest option. No forests, no deep woods where ancient hungers might still prowl. I sleep with the lights on most nights, and I've never been camping since. But sometimes, in the early hours before dawn when the desert is still and quiet, I hear scratching at my windows. And sometimes when I'm brave enough to look, I see Marcus standing in my backyard, exactly as he was before the wendigo took him. He never tries to get in, never speaks. He just stands there watching me with eyes that hold a sadness deeper than death. I know it's not really him. Marcus died in that cabin fire, along with the creature that had been feeding on his guilt. What visits me now is something else. Maybe my own conscience, maybe just the lingering echo of trauma. The mind creates its own monsters after all, but whether it's real or imaginary doesn't really matter. The guilt is still there, growing stronger each night, because I know the truth about what happened in Brown County, and I know that somewhere in the vast forests of North America, other wendigos are being born from other people's shame and self-loathing. And sometimes, when the scratching at my windows gets particularly persistent, I find myself wondering if I should just open the door and let whatever's out there come in. It would be easier than carrying this weight alone. The guilt is a living thing now, feeding on itself, growing stronger with each passing day. And I'm beginning to understand what Marcus meant when he said the only way to make things right was to stop running from what we've done. Tonight, I think I might finally find the courage to step outside and face whatever's waiting for me in the dark. Because in the end, We all have to feed the monster we've created. We all have to pay the price for our sins. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 24 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Brown County State Park in Indiana, in a place locals call the Whispering Pines. Though after what happened there, I understand why most people refuse to speak its name aloud. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Sarah Rodriguez, my girlfriend of 2 years, had been stressed about her nursing program finals. Brian Wright, my roommate since freshman year, needed a break from his engineering thesis. Jessica Davis, Sarah's best friend since high school, had just gone through a brutal breakup and wanted to get away from everything. The four of us had camped together before, but never this deep into the Indiana backcountry. "You sure this is the right trail?" Jessica asked, adjusting her backpack straps for the third time in 10 minutes. Her auburn hair was already escaping from her ponytail, and sweat beaded on her freckled forehead despite the October chill. I checked my GPS again, frowning at the weak signal. Should be just another mile to the clearing Brian found online. The device flickered, showing our blue dot somewhere in a vast green expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Brian jogged ahead of us, his tall frame moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up hiking these hills. "Trust me, guys. My uncle used to hunt out here before they expanded the park boundaries. Said there's this perfect clearing with a natural spring. Totally isolated." "That's what I'm afraid of," Sarah muttered, but she was smiling. She'd been the one to suggest we needed to go somewhere completely off the grid. No cell service, no distractions. Just us and nature. If only we'd known what else was waiting in those woods. The trail grew narrower as we climbed, ancient oaks pressing close on both sides. Their branches formed a canopy so thick that even in the afternoon, shadows pooled like black water between the trees. The autumn leaves crunched under our boots with sounds that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. "Anybody else notice how quiet it is?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible above our footsteps. She was right. No bird song, no chittering of squirrels, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed muffled here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Animals probably just smell us coming," Brian called back, but I caught the slight uncertainty in his voice. "We're the intruders here." The GPS signal died completely as we crested a ridge. I shook the device, checked the battery, full charge, but the screen showed nothing but a blank gray void where the map should be. "That's weird," I said, showing it to Sarah. "It was working fine this morning." "Mine too," she said, pulling out her phone. The screen was black. She pressed the power button repeatedly. "It won't turn on, but I charged it to full last night." One by one, we checked our devices. Every phone, GPS unit, and portable charger was completely dead. Not drained, dead, as if they'd been hit by some kind of electromagnetic pulse. "Well, that's not ominous at all," Jessica said, but she tried to make it sound like a joke. The laugh that followed was too high, too forced. Brian pointed through a gap in the trees. "There, I can see the clearing." The space opened before us like a wound in the forest, a perfect circle of grass surrounded by towering pines. A small spring bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks, creating a clear pool before trickling away into the undergrowth. It should have been beautiful. It was beautiful, but something about it felt wrong, like walking into a church where the altar has been desecrated. "This is perfect," Sarah said, but her voice sounded strange, hollow. She dropped her pack and turned in a slow circle, taking in the clearing. So quiet, so peaceful. I watched her face as she spoke. Her pupils were dilated, and she was smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "You okay, babe?" She blinked, and for a moment she looked confused, as if she'd just woken up. "Yeah, of course, just tired from the hike." But her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water bottle. We set up camp in the center of the clearing, our tents forming a rough square around a fire pit Brian constructed from stones he found near the spring. The work went smoothly, too smoothly. Usually, setting up camp involved at least one argument about tent placement or someone forgetting a crucial piece of equipment. This time, we moved with an eerie synchronization, as if we were all following some unspoken choreography. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped fast. October in Indiana could be unpredictable, but this felt like more than normal autumn chill. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep through your clothes and settle in your bones. "I'll get us some firewood," Brian announced, shouldering a small hatchet. "There's plenty of deadfall just past those trees." "Don't go too far," I called after him. "It's getting dark fast." He waved without turning around. "I'll be back before you know it." That was at 6:47 p.m. I know because I made a point of checking my watch, one of those old-fashioned analog ones my grandfather had given me. It was the only timepiece among us that still worked. By 7:15, Brian hadn't returned. "Maybe he found a really good stash of wood," Jessica said, but her voice was tight with worry. "You know how he gets when he's focused on something." I did know. Brian was the type who would spend an hour organizing his closet by color and season. But he was also reliable to a fault. If he said he'd be back before dark, he'd be back before dark. "I'm going to look for him," I said, grabbing my flashlight. "We'll all go," Sarah said quickly. "Safety in numbers, right?" But when I pressed the button on my flashlight, nothing happened. I shook it, checked the batteries. They rattled loosely in their compartment, completely drained. "Try yours," I said to Sarah. Hers was dead too. So was Jessica's. So were the backup batteries in all our packs. Every single power source we'd brought had somehow been completely drained. "This is really starting to freak me out," Jessica whispered. The darkness was falling faster than it should have, as if someone was slowly turning down a dimmer switch on the world. The trees around the clearing had become black silhouettes against a sky that was still tinged with the last purple remnants of sunset. "Brian," I called out. My voice seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. "Brian," Sarah joined in. "Where are you?" No answer, not even an echo. We huddled together in the center of the clearing, suddenly aware of how exposed we were. The darkness pressed against us from all sides, thick and almost tangible. It was the kind of darkness that made you want to check over your shoulder every few seconds, that made you imagine shapes moving just at the edge of your vision. "Look," Jessica said, pointing toward the tree line. "Someone's coming." A figure emerged from between the pines, moving with Brian's familiar long-legged stride. Relief flooded through me like warm water. "Thank God," Sarah breathed. "Brian, we were starting to worry." But as the figure came closer, the relief curdled into something else, something cold and wrong. It was Brian. I could see his face clearly now in the dim starlight, his sandy hair, his blue jacket. But he wasn't carrying any firewood. His hands hung empty at his sides and he was smiling. A wide, constant smile that never wavered, never changed, as if it had been carved into his face. "Hey guys," he said, his voice perfectly normal. "Sorry I'm late." "Where's the wood?" I asked. "Wood?" He tilted his head, still smiling that unchanging smile. "Oh, right, the wood. I forgot." Brian never forgot anything. Ever. "Are you feeling okay?" Sarah approached him slowly. "You look different." "I feel great," he said. His eyes were very bright in the darkness, almost reflective like an animal's. "Never better. We should probably get some sleep soon, though. Big day tomorrow." "What big day?" Jessica asked. Brian's smile somehow managed to get wider. "You'll see." I watched him carefully as we prepared for bed. He moved right, spoke right, even laughed at the same stupid jokes he always did. But there were little things. The way he never blinked, how his head turned just a fraction too far when he looked at something, the fact that he hadn't eaten anything despite claiming to be starving when he left. "I'm exhausted," he announced suddenly. "I think I'll turn in." He unzipped his tent and crawled inside. A moment later, we heard the zipper close from the inside. "Something's wrong with him," Sarah whispered when we were sure he couldn't hear us. "Yeah, but what?" I asked. Maybe he hit his head or something. Fell while he was looking for wood. People don't just start acting like that from a bump on the head, Jessica said. She was shivering, though whether from cold or fear, I couldn't tell. And did you see his eyes? They were reflecting light like a cat's. We tried to start a fire without matches. All of our lighters had mysteriously stopped working too, but the wood refused to catch. Even when we managed to get some tinder smoldering, the flames would sputter and die as soon as we added larger pieces. It was as if the forest itself was fighting against our attempts to create light and warmth. Eventually, we gave up and retreated to our tents. Sarah and I shared one. Jessica had her own, and Brian's tent sat silent and dark about 20 feet away. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered as we settled into our sleeping bags. "Something is really, really wrong here." I pulled her close, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against my chest. "We'll figure it out in the morning. Maybe get Brian to a doctor when we hike back." What if he won't come with us? It was a question I couldn't answer. I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. A sort of rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging across fabric. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Sarah was still asleep beside me, her breathing deep and regular. The sound was coming from outside the tent, very close. I held my breath and listened. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from right next to my head, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. Something was dragging its claws along the outside of our tent in a deliberate, patient pattern. I reached slowly for the tent zipper, planning to peek outside, when the scratching stopped. Footsteps, too light and quick to be human, pattered away across the clearing. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. But in the soft earth beside our tent, I could see marks. Deep gouges in the dirt, as if something with very long, very sharp claws had been kneeling right next to where we slept. The marks were still warm. Morning came late, the sun struggling to penetrate the canopy of trees that seemed to have grown thicker overnight. When I emerged from the tent, Jessica was already awake, sitting on a log and staring at Brian's tent with a haunted expression. "He's been quiet all night," she said without looking at me. "Too quiet. No snoring, no movement, nothing." Brian was a notorious snorer. Sarah and I had spent countless nights listening to him sawing logs through the thin walls of our apartment. "Maybe he's just tired," I said, but I didn't believe it. "Go check on him," Jessica whispered. I approached Brian's tent slowly, my bare feet silent on the dew-wet grass. "Brian, you awake, man?" No response. "Brian," I called louder. Nothing. I reached for the zipper, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't stuck. It was zipped from the inside, and something was holding it shut with considerable force. "Brian, I'm coming in." I pulled harder on the zipper, and suddenly it gave way with a sharp ripping sound. The tent was empty. Not just empty. The sleeping bag was still zipped up and arranged as if someone was sleeping in it, but when I pulled back the top, there was nothing inside. The bag hadn't been slept in at all. "Guys," I called, my voice cracking slightly. "You need to see this." Sarah and Jessica crowded around the tent opening. Jessica let out a small, choked sound when she saw the empty sleeping bag. "How is that possible?" Sarah asked. "We heard him go in. We heard the zipper close." "And it was zipped from the inside," I added. "There's no other way out of the tent." We searched the clearing thoroughly, looking for any sign of where Brian might have gone. There were no footprints leading away from his tent, no disturbed vegetation, no dropped items. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. But near the spring, Jessica found something that made us all go very quiet. "Oh, God," she whispered, pointing at the muddy bank near the water's edge. "Look. Footprints, but not human footprints. These were elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tip of each toe. They were roughly the size of a human foot, but wrong in every other way. and they led from the spring directly to where Brian's tent sat. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "Right now. We pack up and we hike back to the car and we get the hell out of here." "What about Brian?" Jessica asked. "What about him?" Sarah snapped. "That thing we saw last night wasn't Brian. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't him." But even as we rushed to break camp, we encountered new problems. Our backpacks, which we'd left neatly organized outside our tents, were now in complete disarray. Food had been scattered and spoiled, clothing torn and shredded. Our water bottles were empty, though we'd filled them from the spring the night before. Worse, our compass spun wildly no matter which direction we pointed it, and the trail we'd used to hike in seemed to have disappeared entirely. Where the path should have been, we found only thick undergrowth and thorny brambles. "This is impossible," I said, turning in a complete circle. The trail was right here. "Trails don't just disappear," Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. We picked a direction that seemed most likely to lead back toward civilization and started walking. The forest seemed to shift around us as we moved, paths appearing and disappearing, clearings opening up where none had been before. It was like trying to navigate a maze that kept changing its walls. After what felt like hours of hiking, though my watch insisted only 20 minutes had passed, we found ourselves back in the clearing where we'd camped. "No," Sarah said, staring at our abandoned campsite. "No, this isn't possible." We walked in a straight line. "Did we?" I asked. Because now that I thought about it, I couldn't remember making any turns, but the forest had seemed to guide us along a winding path that somehow led us in a circle. Jessica sat down heavily on the log where she'd spent the morning. "We're trapped here, aren't we?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A voice calling from the forest, familiar and friendly. "Hey, where is everyone?" Brian's voice, coming from the same direction he'd disappeared into the night before. "There you are," he said, emerging from the trees with that same constant smile plastered across his face. "I've been looking everywhere for you guys." He looked exactly the same as he had the night before. Same clothes, same expression, same unsettling brightness in his eyes. But now, in the full light of day, I could see other things. His skin had a grayish pallor, like old meat. His movements were just slightly off, as if he was a marionette being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how human beings were supposed to move. "Where have you been?" Sarah demanded, but she kept her distance. "Exploring," Brian said simply. "This place is amazing. You should see what I found deeper in the woods." "What did you find?" Jessica asked. Brian's smile somehow managed to get even wider, stretching his face in ways that human faces shouldn't stretch. "You'll see. Come on, I'll show you." "We're not going anywhere with you," I said firmly. "You're not Brian." The thing wearing Brian's face tilted its head with that too-far motion I'd noticed before. "Of course I'm Brian. Who else would I be?" "Prove it," Sarah said. "Tell us something only Brian would know." It thought for a long moment, still smiling. "We went to college together." "That's not enough," I said. "What's my middle name?" "Brian's known me for 3 years." Another long pause. "It's Michael?" "My name is Michael. My middle name is James, and Brian had used it to tease me countless times. Whatever this thing was, it didn't have access to Brian's memories, only the most basic facts about us. "You're not him," Jessica whispered. The thing's smile faltered for just a moment, and something else showed through, something ancient and hungry and absolutely inhuman. Then the smile returned, but it was different now. Predatory. "You're right," it said in Brian's voice. "I'm not." Its form began to shift and change. The body stretched, limbs elongating unnaturally. The skin took on a mottled gray-brown color like tree bark, and when it opened its mouth, rows of needle-sharp teeth glinted in the dappled sunlight. "But I was him for a while," it continued, its voice deepening into something that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "Wore his skin, tasted his memories. He fought so hard at the end, trying to warn you. but I ate his screams before they could escape his throat. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard her fingernails drew blood. Jessica was making small, whimpering sounds, but she couldn't seem to look away from the creature that had been wearing our friend's face. "What are you?" I managed to ask. "I have many names," it said, "but your people call me Skinwalker. I hunt in the spaces between what is and what should not be. And you walked right into my domain." It took a step toward us, moving with fluid grace despite its distorted form. We stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The clearing was surrounded by thick forest, and we'd already learned that the paths led only in circles. "I could take any of your forms," it continued conversationally. "Live your lives. Visit your families. They would never know the difference, not until it was far too late." "What do you want?" Sarah asked. The creature's laugh was like breaking glass. "What I've always wanted. To hunt, to feed, to become." It lunged forward with impossible speed, but Jessica was faster. She grabbed a heavy stone from Brian's makeshift fire pit and hurled it with all her strength. The rock struck the creature in what would have been its temple if it still looked human, and it staggered backward with a shriek of pain and rage. "Run!" Jessica screamed. We didn't need to be told twice. We scattered in 3 different directions, crashing through the underbrush with no thought except escape. Behind us, the creature's howls of fury echoed through the forest, a sound like nothing that should exist in the natural world. I ran blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and face, roots catching at my feet. The forest seemed to be actively working against me. Thorns that hadn't been there moments before suddenly sprouting in my path, low-hanging branches that tried to clothesline me as I passed. Eventually, my lungs burning and legs shaking with exhaustion, I was forced to stop. I found myself in a small grove of birch trees, their white bark almost glowing in the filtered sunlight. For the first time since we'd arrived at the clearing, the oppressive silence was broken by normal forest sounds: birds calling, insects buzzing, the whisper of wind through leaves. I pulled out my watch. 2:30 p.m. We'd been running for... I tried to remember when we'd scattered, but time seemed slippery here, hard to pin down. A twig snapped behind me and I spun around, heart hammering. Sarah emerged from behind a tree, her face streaked with dirt and blood from dozens of small cuts. She saw me and nearly collapsed with relief. "Thank God," she gasped, throwing her arms around me. I heard screaming. I thought it got you." "Where's Jessica?" I asked. Sarah's face went pale. "I don't know. We got separated almost immediately. The last I saw, she was heading toward that big rock outcropping." We listened carefully, but the forest had returned to its unnatural quiet. No screams, no sounds of pursuit, no sign of either Jessica or the creature. "We have to find her," I said. "What if it's already—" Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. "Then we find her body and get proof of what happened here. But we don't leave without knowing." We made our way carefully through the forest, calling Jessica's name in whispers and jumping at every sound. The trees seemed to press closer together the deeper we went, until we were pushing through branches so thick they blocked out most of the sky. We found her near the base of a limestone cliff that thrust up from the forest floor like a broken bone. She was sitting propped against the rock, her legs extended in front of her, her head tilted back at an impossible angle. "Jessica!" Sarah ran toward her, but I caught her arm. "Wait," I said. "Something's wrong." We approached more slowly. Jessica's eyes were open, staring up at the canopy, but they didn't track our movement. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, so she was breathing. But when I knelt beside her and said her name, she didn't respond. "Jessica?" I touched her shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" She blinked once, very slowly, and turned her head toward me with mechanical precision. When she spoke, her voice was flat and emotionless. "I saw it," she said. "Its true form. Under the skin it wears." "Jessica, we need to get out of here," Sarah said urgently. "Can you walk?" "It's so old," Jessica continued as if Sarah hadn't spoken. "Older than the forests. older than the people who first walked these lands. It's been here so long that the earth itself knows its name." "Jessica, you're scaring me," Sarah said. Jessica's head turned toward Sarah with that same mechanical movement. Her pupils were dilated so wide that her eyes looked black. "It told me things," she said, "about what it does to the people it takes, about the collection it keeps in the deep caves under the mountain, about what it's going to do to us." "What did it tell you?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "It doesn't just kill," Jessica said. "It preserves, keeps them alive just enough to feed on their fear, their pain, their memories. Some of them have been down there for decades, still conscious, still aware, but changed. Twisted into things that barely remember being human. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "It showed me Brian," she continued. "What's left of him. He's still alive, Michael, but he won't be recognizable as human much longer." Sarah was crying now, quiet sobs that she tried to muffle with her hands. "How do we stop it?" I asked. For the first time, something like Jessica's real personality flickered behind her eyes. "Fire," she whispered. "It's afraid of fire. That's why our matches wouldn't work, why the wood wouldn't burn. It was protecting itself." "But we don't have any way to make fire," Sarah said. Jessica reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made my heart leap. A small butane lighter with a clear plastic body. I could see the fuel sloshing inside. "I hid it," she said. "When I realized our other lighters weren't working, I hid this one in my sock. It's still got fuel." "Will it work?" I asked. She flicked it, and a small blue flame danced to life. Hope flooded through me like sunshine after a storm. "We need to get back to the clearing," Jessica said, suddenly sounding more like herself. "It's weakest there, in the open space, and we need tinder. Lots of it." "What about Brian?" Sarah asked. Jessica's face went hard. "Brian is gone. What's wearing his face now is just bait in a trap, and if we don't move fast, we're going to join him in those caves." The journey back to the clearing was a nightmare of wrong turns and false paths. The forest seemed determined to keep us lost, but Jessica had a sense of direction that bordered on supernatural. She led us through thickets that looked impassable and down game trails that appeared and disappeared like mirages. When we finally emerged into the clearing, the creature was waiting for us. It had abandoned Brian's form entirely now, standing in the center of the open space in its true shape. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with elongated limbs that bent in too many places. Its skin was mottled gray and brown, like bark, and covered in coarse black hair. Its face was vaguely human but wrong in every detail. Eyes too large and set too far apart. A mouth that split its face nearly ear to ear, filled with those needle-sharp teeth. "You came back," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "Good. Running makes the meat tough." "You're right about one thing," I said, pulling handfuls of dry grass and dead leaves from my pockets. We'd gathered tinder on the way back, stuffing our clothes with anything that would burn easily. We did come back. I held up Jessica's lighter. The creature's eyes widened and it took an involuntary step backward. "You can't," it hissed. "The fire won't take. This place is mine. I control what burns and what doesn't." "Maybe," I said, flicking the lighter. The flame sprang to life, seeming impossibly bright in the forest gloom. "But this fire isn't from your domain, and neither are we." I touched the flame to the tinder in my hands. For a moment, nothing happened, and I thought the creature was right. Then, slowly, smoke began to curl up from the dry grass. The creature screamed, a sound like metal tearing, and lunged toward me. But Sarah was ready. She threw a handful of her own tinder into my growing flame, and suddenly we had a real fire, crackling and spitting and casting wild shadows around the clearing. The skinwalker pulled up short, its massive form recoiling from the light. Where the flames touched its skin, smoke rose and the flesh bubbled and blackened. "More!" Jessica shouted, throwing armload after armload of deadfall onto the fire. "Keep it burning!" The creature circled us like a trapped animal, its inhuman features contorted with rage and pain. But it couldn't approach the fire, couldn't get close enough to reach us. "This isn't over," it snarled. "I know your scents now, your faces. I'll find you when you leave this place. I'll follow you home. I'll wear the faces of everyone you love until you can't trust anyone, can't sleep, can't—" "Shut up," I said, and threw a burning branch directly at its feet. The creature danced backward with surprising agility, but the flames had spread to the dry grass around the clearing's edge. The fire was growing, feeding on itself, and the skinwalker was running out of places to retreat. "You don't understand," it said, and for the first time, there was something like fear in its voice. "I am the guardian of this place. I keep the balance. Without me, things will come through that make me look like a house pet." "Not our problem," Sarah said grimly. The fire had reached the tree line now, climbing up the trunks of the ancient pines. The creature was pressed against the far edge of the clearing, smoke rising from its skin wherever sparks landed. "I can give you your friend back," it said desperately. "He's still alive, still mostly himself. I can make the trade." For a moment I hesitated. Brian had been my friend for 3 years. We'd been roommates, study partners, drinking buddies. Could I really leave him to whatever fate the creature had planned? But then I remembered Jessica's words about the collection in the caves, about things that had once been human but were now twisted beyond recognition. Even if Brian was still alive, what would be left of him after spending time in that darkness? "Too late," I said, and threw another burning branch. This one caught the creature full in the chest. Its scream shattered the afternoon air, a sound so full of pain and rage that I felt it in my bones. But it was also the sound of something dying. The skinwalker stumbled backward, its form already beginning to blur and shift. It was losing cohesion, becoming something more like smoke than flesh. "I won't forget," it whispered, its voice fading like an echo. "I'll find you. Someday, somewhere, when you least expect it." And then it was gone, dissolved into wisps of gray smoke that the wind scattered through the burning trees. We stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by a ring of fire, and watched the forest burn. Part of me felt bad about starting what would undoubtedly become a major wildfire, but a larger part was just grateful to be alive. "How do we get out of here?" Sarah asked, staring at the wall of flames that now surrounded us. "Same way we got in," Jessica said. She was holding something in her hand, my GPS unit, which was somehow working again. The screen showed a clear map with our location marked and a trail leading back toward the parking area where we'd left the car. "The curse is broken," I said. "With the skinwalker gone, everything should go back to normal." We gathered what few supplies had survived our hasty flight and began the hike out. The trail was exactly where it should have been, clearly marked and easy to follow. Our phones were working again, too, showing full battery and strong signal. It took us 3 hours to reach the car, and we drove straight to the nearest police station. We told them about Brian's disappearance, leaving out the supernatural elements and claiming we'd gotten separated during a hiking accident. They organized a search party, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Either Brian was dead, or he was somewhere no human searcher would ever look. The fire burned for 6 days before they finally got it contained. The news called it the worst wildfire in Brown County's history, destroying over 10,000 acres of old-growth forest. Environmental groups were outraged. Investigators found evidence that the fire had been deliberately set, but they never found any suspects. A month later, Jessica transferred to a school in California. She said she needed a fresh start, somewhere far from Indiana. Sarah and I tried to maintain our relationship, but the shared trauma had changed us both in ways that made it impossible to be together. We broke up just before Christmas. I still think about Brian sometimes. Wonder if there's any part of him still alive somewhere in those deep caves Jessica mentioned. Wonder if the skinwalker was telling the truth about other things coming through now that it's gone. Wonder if I'll ever be able to trust my own senses completely again. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I catch myself checking shadows twice, looking for movements that don't belong, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear something calling my name from the darkness outside my window. It's probably just paranoia. Probably just the lingering trauma of what we experienced in those woods. But I keep a lighter by my bed now, just in case. And I never go camping anymore. My name is Michael Williams and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Hoosier National Forest, near Hemlock Ridge in southern Indiana, 3 months ago. I'm writing this down because the nightmares won't stop, and maybe getting it all out will help me sleep again. Maybe it will help me forget the sound of my dog's last whimper, or the way Sarah's eyes looked when she came back from gathering firewood that final night. I should have listened to the locals in French Lick when they warned me about Hemlock Ridge, should have paid attention when the old man at the gas station told me that people who go up there sometimes don't come back the same. But I was grieving, angry, and desperate for solitude after losing my job and my marriage in the same brutal month. The wilderness called to me like a siren song, promising peace and clarity. Instead, it gave me something else entirely. The plan was simple. 2 weeks of solo backpacking with my German Shepherd, Rex, through the most isolated section of the Hoosier National Forest. I'd done plenty of hiking before, though never alone for this long. Rex was good company. 8 years old, experienced on trails, and protective without being aggressive. We'd been through a lot together, and I figured the solitude would do us both good. I parked my truck at the Hemlock Ridge trailhead on a gray October morning. The parking area was empty except for one other vehicle, a beat-up Honda Civic with Illinois plates. The Forest Service bulletin board displayed the usual warnings about weather, wildlife, and permit requirements, but someone had tacked up a handwritten note that made me pause. Stay away from the hollows after dark. Some things are better left undisturbed. J.M. Rex sniffed around the note, his hackles rising slightly. Dogs sense things we can't, but I dismissed his unease as excitement about the upcoming hike. I shouldered my pack, clipped Rex's leash, and headed up the trail into the dense canopy of maple, oak, and hickory trees. The first 3 days passed without incident. The weather held crisp and clear, perfect for hiking. Rex and I fell into an easy rhythm. Wake at dawn, break camp, hike 6 to 8 miles, set up somewhere with water access, explore the area, sleep deeply under a blanket of stars. The forest was alive with the sounds of October, rustling leaves, bird calls, the distant crack of branches. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. On the 4th day, we met Sarah. I was filtering water from a creek near what my map showed as Devil's Backbone, a narrow ridge that stretched for miles through the deepest part of the forest. Rex started barking, not aggressively but alertly, his ears perked forward. Through the trees came a woman in her late 20s, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing well-worn hiking gear. She looked capable and confident, the kind of person who belonged in the wilderness. "Sorry if I startled you," she called out, raising her hands in a friendly gesture. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, saw your campfire smoke and thought I'd introduce myself. Not many people brave enough to hike this section alone." "Michael Williams," I replied, standing up from the creek. Rex had stopped barking but remained alert, watching her carefully. "You're out here solo too?" "For the past week," she nodded, approaching slowly. Rex allowed her to extend her hand for him to sniff, though he didn't wag his tail. "Mind if I join you for coffee? I haven't talked to another human being in days, and I'm starting to have conversations with the trees." There was something immediately likable about Sarah. She had an easy laugh and seemed genuinely relieved to have company. We spent the evening sharing trail stories and comparing notes about the area. She'd been hiking the region for years and knew it better than my maps could show. "Have you heard the stories about this place?" she asked as we sat by the fire, Rex lying between us but never fully relaxing. "What kind of stories?" "The locals call it cursed. Say there's something in these woods that feeds on lost souls." She laughed, but it sounded forced. Probably just trying to keep tourists away, though I'll admit, some nights up here, you hear things that don't quite fit. What kind of things? Sarah stared into the fire for a long moment. Voices calling your name from the darkness. Footsteps that follow you but stop when you stop. Last night I could have sworn I heard children singing, but there's no way kids would be this deep in the forest. Rex's ears perked up at that, and he let out a low whine. I scratched behind his ears, trying to calm him. Probably just the wind through the trees. Sounds can be deceiving out here. Probably, Sarah agreed, but she didn't sound convinced. We decided to hike together for a few days. Sarah knew shortcuts and hidden campsites that weren't on any map, and the company was welcome after days of solitude. Rex seemed to accept her presence, though he never fully warmed to her. I attributed his caution to protective instincts rather than any real concern. The next morning brought our first taste of the strangeness that would define the rest of our time in those woods. I woke to find our campfire burning brightly, though I was certain we'd extinguished it completely the night before. The flames danced in colors I'd never seen in a wood fire, deep purples and greens that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. "Sarah, did you restart the fire?" I called softly, not wanting to wake her if she was still sleeping. Her tent was empty. The sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, but there was no sign of her. Rex was standing at the edge of our camp, staring into the darkness between the trees, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Sarah!" I called louder, grabbing my flashlight. The beam seemed weaker than it should have been, swallowed by the oppressive darkness that pressed in around us like a living thing. "I'm here," came her voice from somewhere in the trees, but the direction was wrong. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the trunks in impossible ways. "Where? I can't see you." "Gathering wood. Be right back." But she'd emerged from the opposite direction, carrying an armload of dead branches. In the strange firelight, her face looked different somehow. The features the same, but the expression subtly wrong. Her smile was too wide, her blinks too infrequent. "Everything okay?" she asked, dropping the wood near the fire. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "The fire was out when I went to sleep," I said carefully, watching her reaction. "Was it? I got cold around midnight and restarted it. Didn't want to wake you." Her explanation was perfectly reasonable, but something about her tone made my skin crawl. Rex clearly felt it too. He'd backed away from her and was now pressed against my legs, trembling slightly. "What kind of wood makes flames that color?" I asked, pointing at the unnatural purples and greens still dancing among the logs. Sarah looked at the fire with genuine confusion. "What color? It looks normal to me." But as she spoke, the flames shifted back to their familiar orange and yellow, as if her words had broken some kind of spell. I stared at the fire, then at Sarah, then back at the fire. Either I was losing my mind, or something was very wrong. "Maybe I'm more tired than I thought," I said finally. "Let's get some more sleep." But sleep didn't come easily. Rex refused to settle, pacing around our tent and whining softly. Twice I thought I heard voices calling from the forest, sometimes my name, sometimes Sarah's. Once I could have sworn I heard my ex-wife Jennifer calling for help, but that was impossible. She was 300 miles away in Indianapolis. When dawn finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. Sarah emerged from her tent looking refreshed and cheerful, chattering about the day's planned route as she made coffee. But I noticed she'd moved her tent sometime during the night. Instead of being positioned across from mine as it had been when we went to sleep, it was now much closer to the tree line, almost hidden among the shadows. "When did you move your tent?" I asked. She looked puzzled. "I didn't move it. It's been in the same spot since last night." I stared at the tent, then at the clear impression in the earth where it had been originally set up. Either Sarah was lying or something had moved her tent while she slept. The thought of either possibility made my stomach turn. "Rex seems agitated," Sarah observed, crouching down to pet him. He backed away from her touch, something he'd never done with any of our previous hiking companions. Maybe he's picking up the scent of predators. There are black bears in this area. Oh, maybe, I agreed, but I didn't think it was bears that had Rex spooked. We broke camp and continued deeper into the forest, following a barely visible trail that Sarah claimed would take us to a hidden waterfall. The path wound through increasingly dense vegetation, and I noticed my GPS was having trouble maintaining a signal. The compass reading seemed to shift randomly, and my map showed terrain that didn't match what we were actually hiking through. Navigation's always tricky in this part of the forest, Sarah explained when I mentioned it. Something about the mineral deposits in the rocks. They interfere with electronic devices. That might have been true, but it didn't explain why my compass, a simple magnetic instrument, was giving inconsistent readings. By noon, I was convinced we were walking in circles, though Sarah insisted we were making good progress toward the waterfall. The trees seemed to close in around us as we hiked, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably, and our breath began to mist despite the mild October weather. Rex stayed close to my heels, occasionally looking back over his shoulder as if something was following us. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the trail. I listened carefully. Beneath the normal forest sounds, wind, rustling leaves, bird calls, there was something else. A rhythmic sound, almost like chanting or singing, but too distant to make out words. "What is it?" I whispered. "I don't know, but I've been hearing it on and off for the past hour." She looked genuinely concerned for the first time since I'd met her. "It seems to be getting closer." Rex's hackles were standing up, and he was staring fixedly into the trees to our left. Whatever was making the sound, he could sense it better than we could. A low growl started deep in his throat. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested. Something felt fundamentally wrong about this place, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out. "Back where? Do you even know which direction we came from?" I turned around looking for the trail we'd been following. It was gone. The forest floor behind us showed no sign of recent passage, no broken branches or disturbed leaves. It was as if the path had healed itself after we passed. "This isn't possible," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "Trails don't just disappear." Sarah was looking around with what appeared to be genuine confusion. "This is wrong. I know these woods like the back of my hand, but nothing looks familiar." The chanting was definitely getting closer now, and I could start to make out individual voices. Men, women, children, all singing the same wordless melody. Rex had stopped growling and was now whimpering, pressing himself against my legs so hard he was almost knocking me over. "We need to get out of here," I said firmly. "Pick a direction and walk. We'll worry about finding the trail later." But every direction looked the same. Endless rows of trees stretching into gray-green gloom. The chanting surrounded us now, seeming to come from every point of the compass at once. And underneath it, I could hear something else. The sound of footsteps, lots of them, moving through the forest toward our position. "They're coming for us," Sarah said quietly, and for the first time I heard real fear in her voice. "Who's coming for us?" "The lost ones. The people who never made it out." She was backing toward me, her eyes scanning the trees wildly. "They want us to join them." The footsteps were getting closer, and now I could see movement among the trees. Shadowy figures walking in our direction with jerky, unnatural gaits. They weren't quite human-shaped. Too tall and too thin, with limbs that bent at wrong angles. But as they got closer, I realized with horror that they were human, or had been once. Their clothes hung in tatters, their skin was gray and mottled, and their eyes reflected light like an animal's. Rex was barking frantically now, spinning in circles as the figures approached from all sides. There had to be dozens of them, maybe hundreds, moving through the forest with single-minded purpose. The chanting grew louder as they closed in, and I could finally make out the words. "Join us. Join us. Join us." "Run!" I gasped, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her in what I hoped was the direction we'd come from. But the terrain had changed somehow. Instead of level ground, we were now running up a steep hill that I was certain hadn't been there before. The lost ones followed, crashing through the underbrush behind us with inhuman speed. Rex ran alongside us, occasionally looking back and snarling at our pursuers. The sound of their pursuit was like nothing I'd ever heard, a combination of running footsteps, breaking branches, and an otherworldly howling that made my teeth ache. We crested the hill and found ourselves on the edge of a deep ravine that definitely hadn't been on my map. The sides were nearly vertical, dropping at least 50 feet to a rocky bottom. There was no way down, and the lost ones were almost upon us. "This way," Sarah shouted, pulling me along the rim of the ravine. But after a few hundred yards, the ground simply ended. We were standing on the edge of a cliff with nothing but empty air in front of us. The lost ones emerged from the trees behind us, moving slowly now that they had us trapped. Up close, they were even more horrifying. Their gray skin was marked with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift, and their mouths opened too wide, revealing rows of blackened teeth. But worst of all were their eyes, completely white, without pupils or irises, yet somehow still focused on us with predatory intelligence. "Jump," one of them said in a voice like grinding stone. "Join us. Feed the hunger." "Never," I snarled, pulling Rex closer and looking for any possible escape route. But Sarah was stepping toward them, her expression dreamy and distant. "Maybe they're right," she said softly. "Maybe this is where we belong." "Sarah, no." I reached for her, but she was already walking toward the lost ones, her arms outstretched in welcome. "Join us," the creatures chanted, reaching out to embrace her. "Feed the hunger. Become eternal." I grabbed my pack and threw it as hard as I could at the nearest lost one, hoping to distract them long enough to grab Sarah. The creature didn't even flinch as the pack hit it in the chest, but the impact seemed to break whatever spell had been drawing Sarah forward. She stumbled backward, her eyes clearing. "Michael, what's happening to me?" "We're getting out of here," I said grimly, looking around for any possible escape route. That's when I noticed something strange. The lost ones weren't actually touching the ground. They hovered just slightly above the earth, their feet never quite making contact with the forest floor. "The cliff," I said suddenly. "It's not real. None of this is real." "What are you talking about?" "Look at their feet. They're not touching the ground. This whole place is some kind of illusion." I didn't fully understand what I was saying, but something deep in my gut told me I was right. The ravine, the cliff, even the trail disappearing, it's all designed to trap us here. Sarah looked where I was pointing and gasped. "You're right, but if it's an illusion, how do we break it?" The lost ones were advancing again, their chanting growing more urgent. Rex was backing toward the cliff edge, whimpering in terror. We were almost out of time. "Close your eyes," I said, grabbing Sarah's hand and Rex's collar. "Trust me, the cliff isn't real." "Are you insane? We'll fall to our deaths." "No, we won't, because there's nothing to fall into." I hoped I was right. If I was wrong, we'd be dead in seconds. But if I was right, I stepped backward off the cliff, pulling Sarah and Rex with me. Instead of falling, we stumbled backward onto solid ground. The illusion shattered like breaking glass, and suddenly we were standing in a small clearing surrounded by normal-looking trees. The lost ones were gone, the chanting had stopped, and my compass was pointing steadily north again. "What the hell just happened?" Sarah gasped, looking around wildly. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to get out of these woods. Now." It took us 3 hours of hard hiking to find a trail I recognized, and another 2 hours to reach my truck. By the time we got back to the parking area, the sun was setting, and the Honda Civic with Illinois plates was gone. We drove in convoy to French Lick, neither of us speaking much during the journey. At the motel, Sarah went straight to her room while I checked Rex for injuries. He seemed physically fine, but something in his behavior had changed. He was jumpy and nervous, flinching at shadows and refusing to let me out of his sight. I knew exactly how he felt. I didn't see Sarah again until the next morning. When she knocked on my door, I almost didn't recognize her. Her face was gaunt and pale, with dark circles under her eyes that made her look like she'd aged 10 years overnight. "I need to tell you something," she said without preamble, "about what happened in the woods." "What about it?" "I remember parts of it differently than you do." She sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly. "In my memory, we never escaped. We're still there, trapped in that forest with those things. This conversation we're having right now. It feels like a dream." A chill ran down my spine. "That's impossible. We're here. We're safe. Are we?" She looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge. "How do you know this isn't another illusion? How do you know we ever really left?" I wanted to argue with her to prove that we were really sitting in a motel room in French Lick, Indiana. But the more I thought about it, the more uncertain I became. The escape had seemed too easy, too convenient. And there were gaps in my memory. How exactly had we found the trail? When had the Honda Civic left the parking area? "You're scaring me," I said. Sarah smiled, but it was the same too wide smile I'd seen in the firelight that first strange night. "You should be scared, because I think part of us never left those woods. And I think that part is getting stronger." She stood up and walked toward the door, her movements stiff and unnatural. "I'll see you around, Michael, in the forest. We'll be waiting." She left without another word, and I never saw her again. At least, I hope I never saw her again. Sometimes, late at night, I think I catch glimpses of a familiar blonde ponytail in my peripheral vision. But when I turn to look, there's nothing there. Rex never fully recovered from our experience in Hemlock Ridge. He developed a fear of forests, refusing to go near any wooded area. Even walking past a single tree would send him into a panic. The vet couldn't find anything physically wrong with him, but his behavior became increasingly erratic. 3 weeks after our return, he disappeared from my backyard. I found him the next morning at the edge of the woods behind my house, dead with no obvious cause. His eyes had turned completely white. I tried to convince myself that Sarah was wrong, that we had really escaped and everything was back to normal. But the nightmares started almost immediately. Every night I dream I'm back in those woods, and the lost ones are still hunting me. In the dreams, I can hear Sarah's voice calling to me from the darkness, telling me to join them, to feed the hunger. Worse are the times when I'm awake but not entirely sure I'm awake. I'll be sitting in my apartment, watching TV or reading a book, when suddenly the walls seem to shimmer and I can smell the musty scent of the forest floor. I'll hear chanting in the distance, and my compass will start spinning wildly even though it's sitting on my kitchen table. 3 months have passed since Hemlock Ridge, and I'm beginning to think Sarah was right. I don't think we ever really left those woods. I think whatever lives in that forest is slowly pulling us back, piece by piece, until there's nothing left of who we used to be. Last night, I woke up to find mud on my shoes and pine needles in my hair. My apartment door was standing wide open, and I could hear voices calling my name from the darkness outside. I know I should run, should get as far away from Indiana as possible. But part of me wants to answer those voices. Part of me wants to go back to the forest and join the others who never made it out. I can feel that part getting stronger every day. If you're reading this, it means I've made my choice. Don't come looking for me. And whatever you do, stay away from Hemlock Ridge. Some hungers are never satisfied, and some places hold on to visitors long after they think they've left. The lost ones are always recruiting, and they're very, very patient. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Hickory Ridge in Hoosier National Forest, Indiana, during the third week of October 2023. Brian Wright had been my best friend since we were 12 years old, building forts in the woods behind my childhood home in Bloomington. 20 years later, we still maintained that bond, though life had carved different paths for us. He'd become a successful accountant while I worked as a paramedic. But that October, Brian was falling apart. His divorce had been finalized in August, and the weight of losing his wife Sarah and seeing his kids only on weekends was crushing him. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and he'd lost 20 pounds from barely eating. When I suggested a weekend camping trip to the place we'd explored as teenagers, the deep woods of Hoosier National Forest, he agreed with the desperate enthusiasm of a drowning man grabbing a rope. "Just like old times, Kenny," he said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "Remember when we got lost near Hickory Ridge and had to sleep under that rock overhang?" I remembered. We'd been 14, cocky and stupid, thinking we knew those woods better than we did. We'd spent a terrifying night huddled together while something large moved through the darkness around us, snapping branches and making sounds that weren't quite animal, weren't quite human. "Different this time," I assured him. "We've got GPS, proper gear, and 2 decades of wisdom." The irony of that statement would haunt me. We drove out Friday afternoon in my Jeep, taking State Road 37 south from Bloomington before turning onto Forest Road 967, a narrow gravel track that wound deeper into the national forest than most tourists ventured. The October air carried the metallic scent of approaching winter, and the maple and oak trees blazed in their final show of red and gold before the long death of winter. Brian seemed more animated than he'd been in months as we bounced along the rutted road. "God, I forgot how beautiful it is out here," he said, rolling down his window to breathe in the pine-scented air. "Sarah never wanted to camp, said it was dirty and primitive." I bit back a comment about Sarah. The woman had been poison in a pretty package, slowly isolating Brian from his friends and hobbies until he was a shell of himself. The divorce might have been the best thing that ever happened to him, though he couldn't see it yet. We parked at the end of Forest Road 967, where the pavement gave way to a hiking trail marked only by a small wooden sign. Hickory Ridge Trail, 3.2 miles. Beyond that lay thousands of acres of undeveloped forest, rolling hills thick with old-growth timber and limestone caves that early settlers had used as shelters. Loading our packs, we set off into the woods. The trail was well maintained for the first mile, then became increasingly overgrown as fewer hikers ventured this deep. By the time we reached the ridge, the path was little more than deer tracks winding between massive oak trees whose trunks were easily 4 feet in diameter. "There," Brian pointed to a small clearing about 50 yards off the trail. "That's perfect." The site was indeed ideal. Flat ground surrounded by trees, with a ring of stones that suggested previous campers had used it. A small creek gurgled nearby, and the clearing commanded a view of the valley below through gaps in the canopy. We made camp efficiently, our old partnership reasserting itself. Brian gathered firewood while I pitched our tents and organized our supplies. The familiar routine seemed to lift his spirits further, and for the first time in months, I heard him laugh. Really laugh, when he tripped over a root and sent an armload of branches scattering. "Smooth as ever," I teased. "Shut up," he grinned, that boyish smile I remembered from our youth. As evening approached, we built a fire and opened a couple of beers. The flames painted dancing shadows on the trees around us, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out in a voice like a ghost's whisper. "I needed this," Brian said quietly, staring into the fire. "I've been so lost, Kenny. Some days I don't even know who I am anymore." "You're the same guy who convinced me to sneak into Old Man Peterson's barn to rescue that injured raccoon," I said. "You're the same guy who drove 3 hours to my dad's funeral, even though you had the flu. You're just going through hell right now." He nodded, taking a long pull from his beer. "Sometimes I wonder if it would be easier to just disappear. Start over somewhere else. Become someone else entirely." The words sent an inexplicable chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. "Don't talk like that. You've got too much to live for. Your kids, your work. Hell, who else is going to keep me from doing stupid shit?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, you're right. Just dark thoughts, you know?" We talked until nearly midnight, the conversation meandering through shared memories and uncertain futures. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and we banked the fire before retiring to our respective tents. I was awakened sometime later by the sound of rustling outside. My phone showed 3:17 a.m., and the fire had died to glowing embers. The rustling came again, too deliberate to be wind, too large to be a small animal. "Brian," I whispered. No response. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. Brian's tent was zipped shut, but I could see his sleeping bag through the mesh window. It appeared empty. The rustling came from the direction of the creek, and I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of my tent. The October night was brutally cold, my breath forming clouds in the still air. "Brian," I called softly, not wanting to wake him if he was just taking a leak, but loud enough that he'd hear me if he was in trouble. No answer. I followed the sound toward the creek, my flashlight beam dancing across the trees. The sound stopped as soon as I started moving, as if whatever was making it had heard me coming. The creek was about 30 yards from our campsite, a narrow ribbon of water flowing over smooth stones. The sound of running water masked any other noises, and my flashlight revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth. "Brian," I called again, louder this time. A stick snapped behind me and I spun around. My flashlight beam swept across the trees, revealing nothing but shadows that seemed to shift and move in ways that made my eyes water. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood turn to ice water. It was laughter, but wrong. Too high-pitched, lasting too long, with a quality that seemed to echo from inside my own skull rather than from any external source. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but the screen remained black despite having a full charge when I went to sleep. Dead. "Brian," I shouted, abandoning any pretense of quiet. The laughter came again, closer this time, and I realized it was coming from the direction of our campsite. I hurried back, my flashlight beam jerking wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Brian's tent was still zipped shut, his sleeping bag still apparently empty. But as I approached, I heard movement inside. "Brian, Jesus, man, you scared the hell out of me. Where were you?" The tent zipper moved slowly downward, and Brian's head emerged. In the glow of my flashlight, his face looked pale and strange, his eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. "I was sleeping," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "No, you weren't. Your sleeping bag was empty. I heard something by the creek and went to look for you." He stared at me for a long moment without blinking. "I was sleeping," he repeated, exactly the same tone. Something was wrong. Brian was many things, stubborn, emotional, occasionally pig-headed, but he'd never lied to me. Not once in 20 years. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked. He smiled, but it was all wrong. Too wide, held too long, and it didn't touch his eyes at all. "I feel perfect," he said. I stood there in the cold, my flashlight trained on my best friend's face, and felt the first real stirring of fear. Not the adrenaline-fueled alarm I'd felt while searching for him, but something deeper and more primal. The kind of fear our ancestors felt when they realized they were being stalked by something with too many teeth and too much patience. "Well, I'm awake now," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "Might as well get the fire going again." "Good idea," Brian said, his smile never wavering. "I'll help." But he didn't move. He just knelt there in the opening of his tent, smiling that horrible smile, while I gathered kindling and coaxed the embers back to life. The whole time, I could feel his eyes on me, though when I glanced over, he was staring off into the trees. Once the fire was crackling again, I sat down on one of the logs we'd dragged over earlier. Brian finally emerged from his tent and sat across from me. The firelight painted his face in shifting patterns of orange and black, making his features seem to move and change. "Remember the story you used to tell about the wendigo?" he asked suddenly. The question hit me like a physical blow. I had told him that story. Once, when we were 15 and trying to scare each other around a campfire much like this one. But it had been Brian's idea to stop, claiming the story was too disturbing. He'd had nightmares for a week afterward. "You hated that story," I said carefully. "Did I?" He tilted his head with bird-like precision. "I don't remember hating it. Tell it again." "It's late, man. We should get some sleep. Please," he said, and his voice carried a pleading quality that was somehow worse than the flatness from before. "I want to hear it." Every instinct I had was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong, but this was Brian, my oldest friend, my brother in everything but blood. Maybe the stress of the divorce was affecting him more than I'd realized. Maybe he was having some kind of breakdown. "The wendigo was supposed to be a cannibal spirit," I said slowly. "According to the legends, it was once human, but hunger and desperation in the wilderness drove it to eat human flesh. The act transformed it into something else, something that could never be satisfied, always hungry for more." Brian leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "What did it look like?" "Tall, emaciated with yellowed fangs and long claws, but the worst part was that it could imitate human voices, lure people away from safety by sounding like someone they knew and trusted." "Interesting," Brian said, sitting back. "And you believe in such things?" The way he phrased it, formal, detached, like he was conducting an interview, sent another chill through me. "It's just a story, Brian." "Of course," he agreed, but his smile suggested otherwise. We sat in silence after that, the fire popping and crackling between us. I found myself studying Brian's face, looking for signs of the man I'd known for 2 decades. The features were all there: the slightly crooked nose from a childhood baseball accident, the scar on his chin from falling off his bike, the way his left eyebrow was slightly higher than his right. But something essential was missing, like looking at a photograph instead of a living person. "I'm going to try to get some more sleep," I said finally. "Good idea," Brian replied. "Sleep is important." I retreated to my tent but didn't bother taking off my boots. Instead, I lay on top of my sleeping bag, fully dressed, and tried to process what was happening. Maybe Brian was having a psychotic break. The stress of the divorce, the isolation of the woods, some kind of sleep disorder. There had to be a rational explanation. But rational explanations didn't account for the way he'd been staring at me, or the wrongness of his smile, or the fact that he'd somehow gotten back into his tent without me seeing him return from wherever he'd been. I must have dozed fitfully, because I was awakened by the sound of movement outside my tent. My phone still showed a black screen, but the quality of darkness suggested it was still several hours before dawn. The movement came again. Footsteps circling my tent in a slow, deliberate pattern. Around and around, always at the same measured pace. "Brian," I whispered. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the hammering of my own heart. Seconds stretched into minutes, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then something pressed against the side of my tent from outside, like a large hand pushing against the fabric. The pressure moved slowly along the wall, as if whatever was out there was feeling its way around the perimeter. I fumbled for my flashlight and switched it on. The beam illuminated the tent wall just as the pressure reached the spot directly next to my head. I could see the clear outline of fingers pressing against the fabric, but they were wrong. Too long, with too many joints. "Brian," I said again, louder this time. "What the hell are you doing?" The pressure stopped. Then, from directly outside my tent flap came Brian's voice. "Come out, Kenny. I want to show you something." But I could hear another sound underneath his words, a wet, clicking noise like joints popping or bones grinding together. "Show me in the morning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It has to be now," Brian's voice insisted. "While it's dark. Come out." The clicking sound grew louder, and I realized it was the sound of something large moving through the undergrowth, something that moved on too many legs, or legs that bent in directions human legs shouldn't bend. I grabbed my sleeping bag and huddled in the corner of my tent farthest from the voice. "I'm not coming out, Brian. Whatever's wrong with you, we'll deal with it in the morning." A long silence followed. Then Brian laughed. That same wrong, too long laugh I'd heard earlier. "That's okay, Kenny," he said, his voice moving around the tent as he circled it again. "I can wait. I'm very patient." The footsteps resumed their steady circuit, and I realized with growing horror that they were getting closer with each revolution. The tent was large enough that someone walking around it should have been at least 6 feet away from me at the closest point. But the footsteps were only a few feet away now, as if the tent was somehow shrinking. I closed my eyes and tried to think rationally. Stress, exhaustion, the power of suggestion. Maybe I was the one having a breakdown. Maybe Brian was perfectly normal and I was losing my mind. But when I opened my eyes, my flashlight beam revealed that the tent walls were indeed closer than they should be, bowing inward as if something enormous was pressing against them from all sides. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent flap. "Kenny," Brian's voice said, but now it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, above me, below me, inside the walls of the tent itself. "I really think you should come out. We need to talk." The zipper of my tent began to move, sliding down with mechanical precision. I scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The tent walls pressed against me from all sides, and I could feel something vast and hungry waiting just beyond the thin barrier of fabric. The zipper reached the bottom, and the tent flap fell open. Brian knelt outside, silhouetted against the dying fire. At first glance, he looked normal. The same clothes, the same build, the same face, but as my eyes adjusted, I began to notice the details that were wrong. His limbs were too long, as if someone had grabbed his arms and legs and stretched them like taffy. His fingers ended in points that might have been fingernails or might have been claws. And his smile, God, his smile stretched from ear to ear, revealing far too many teeth. "There you are," he said in Brian's voice. I was starting to worry. I tried to speak but could only manage a choked whimper. "You look scared, Kenny," the thing wearing Brian's face observed. "Why are you scared?" It tilted its head, and I heard vertebrae pop like bubble wrap. One of its 2 long arms reached toward me, fingers flexing with wet, clicking sounds. That's when my paralysis broke. I lunged forward, shoving past the creature and rolling out of the tent. It made a sound of surprise, a noise like steam escaping from a kettle, and I felt claws rake across my back as I scrambled to my feet. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, leaving the campsite in near total darkness. My flashlight was still in the tent and my phone was dead. I could hear the thing that looked like Brian moving behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran. The forest at night was a maze of shadows and obstacles. Branches caught at my clothes and whipped across my face. Roots tried to trip me, and more than once I slammed into tree trunks that materialized out of the darkness like solid black walls. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, but it didn't sound like running. It sounded like something large flowing through the undergrowth, moving with liquid grace between the trees. And always, there was Brian's voice calling after me. "Kenny, where are you going? Come back." I had no idea which direction I was heading. The hiking trail could have been 50 yards away or 5 miles. In the absolute darkness, every direction looked the same. But I kept running, driven by a terror so pure it felt like ice water in my veins. I must have been running for 10 minutes when I stumbled into a small clearing and realized I was completely lost. The trees formed a solid wall around me, and I couldn't even tell which direction I'd come from. The pursuit sounds had stopped. I stood in the center of the clearing, gasping for breath, straining to hear anything that might give me a clue about where I was or where the thing behind me had gone. The silence was complete. No wind, no insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I heard Brian's voice, but now it was coming from above me. "Found you." I looked up and saw something crouched in the branches of the oak tree at the edge of the clearing. It had Brian's general shape, but it was positioned in a way that would have been impossible for a human, hanging upside down like a bat, with its limbs bent at angles that made my stomach turn. "Why did you run, Kenny?" it asked, and its voice carried a note of genuine hurt that was somehow more disturbing than its earlier emotionless tone. "I just wanted to talk." "You're not Brian," I said, surprised that my voice worked at all. "Of course I'm Brian," it replied, beginning to move down the tree trunk head first. "Don't you recognize me? We've been best friends for 20 years. But as it moved, its shape shifted and flowed like smoke. Sometimes it looked like Brian, sometimes like something with too many joints and not enough skin. And always there were those teeth, far too many of them, gleaming white in the darkness. "Brian would never hurt me," I said. It reached the base of the tree and began to approach, moving with that unnatural flowing motion. "But I'm not going to hurt you, Kenny. I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you become like me." "What are you?" It stopped about 10 feet away and tilted its head again. "I'm your best friend. I'm the thing that lives in the hungry darkness between the trees. I'm the answer to every prayer you've ever made for the pain to stop." Its voice shifted, becoming multiple voices speaking in unison. "I'm everyone who ever walked into these woods alone and desperate and never walked out again." The pieces clicked together in my mind. "Where's Brian? The real Brian?" "He's here," it said, spreading its arms wide. "He's part of me now, part of us. He was so tired, Kenny, so sad and broken and ready to give up. We gave him peace." "You killed him." "We saved him," it corrected. "And we want to save you too. You've been taking care of everyone else for so long. Your patients, your friends, your family. When was the last time someone took care of you?" The words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Being a paramedic meant constantly witnessing suffering, constantly being strong for people in their worst moments. The weight of it had been building for years, and lately I'd been feeling stretched thin, exhausted in ways that sleep couldn't fix. "We can take that burden away," the thing continued, moving closer. "No more pain, no more responsibility, no more watching people you care about hurt and being powerless to fix them. Just peace. Just the long, sweet darkness where nothing hurts anymore." For a moment, God help me, I was tempted. The idea of giving up, of letting something else take over the exhausting job of being Kenneth Young, was seductive in a way that terrified me. But then I thought of Brian. The real Brian, not this mockery wearing his face. I thought of his kids who would never know what really happened to their father. I thought of the people counting on me, the lives I might still save. "No," I said. The thing's smile faltered. "No." I said no. I want my friend back. It studied me for a long moment, then began to laugh. Not Brian's laugh, but something that sounded like breaking glass and tearing metal. "Your friend is gone, Kenny. He made his choice. He walked into the woods one night and never came back. What's standing here is just what grew from what he left behind." "Prove it," I said. "If you're really Brian, tell me something only he would know." It was a desperate gambit, but the thing considered the challenge seriously. "We built a fort in the woods behind your house when we were 12, it said. "We found a dead cat there, and you threw up because the smell was so bad. We buried it together and promised never to tell anyone." My heart sank. It was a memory only Brian and I shared, one we'd never told another soul. But then the thing continued. "And that's when I first tasted death, Kenny. That's when I first understood what I was meant to become." The words were wrong. Brian had been disturbed by finding the dead cat, not fascinated by it. He'd insisted we bury it properly, even said a little prayer over the grave. The thing might have Brian's memories, but it was interpreting them through its own twisted perspective. "You're not Brian," I said again, more firmly this time. The creature's face began to change, the features shifting and flowing like melted wax. "Then I suppose there's no point in pretending anymore. What emerged from the transformation was nightmare-made flesh. It retained Brian's general size and shape, but its skin had turned the color of old bones, stretched tight over a frame that seemed to have too many joints. Its fingers had become claws, its teeth had multiplied into rows of needles, and its eyes were black holes in its skull, depths that seemed to go on forever. "This is what hunger looks like, Kenny," it said, and its voice was no longer human at all. "This is what happens when you want something so badly that you're willing to consume everything to get it." It began to move toward me again, but this time there was no pretense of friendship. It moved like a predator, low and fluid, and I knew with absolute certainty that if it reached me I would die, or worse, become like it. I looked around desperately for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. The clearing was empty except for a few fallen branches, none of them large enough to do any real damage. But at the far edge of the clearing, I could make out what looked like a rock formation, maybe a limestone outcropping with caves like the ones early settlers had used. I broke into a sprint, the creature's inhuman howl echoing behind me. The rock formation was further away than it had looked, and I could hear my pursuer gaining ground with each step. Something that might have been claws raked across my shoulder, tearing through my jacket and into the flesh beneath. The rocks loomed up in front of me, not a formation, but the remains of an old stone foundation, probably from a cabin that had stood here decades or even centuries ago. But among the tumbled stones, I could see something that made my heart leap. The metallic glint of an old axe head, its handle long since rotted away but the iron blade still intact. I grabbed the axe head just as the creature slammed into me, driving us both to the ground. Its weight pressed down on me and I could feel its breath on my face, hot and fetid, like air escaping from a grave. "You should have said yes," it hissed, its face inches from mine. "Now you'll just be meat." I drove the axe head upward with all the strength I had left, feeling it bite deep into whatever passed for the creature's torso. It screamed, a sound like feedback from a broken speaker, and black ichor sprayed across my face, but the wound didn't slow it down. If anything, it seemed to make it more aggressive. Its claws raked across my chest and I felt ribs crack under the pressure of its grip. "Iron hurts, doesn't it?" I gasped, twisting the axe head deeper. The creature's black eyes widened with what might have been surprise. "How did you—" "Because Brian told me the stories, too," I said. "About the old ways, the things people used to know about protecting themselves from the things in the dark." I'd remembered a detail from one of Brian's favorite books about folklore, that cold iron was supposed to be effective against supernatural creatures. It was a long shot, but the creature's reaction suggested I'd guessed right. I wrenched the axe head sideways and the creature stumbled backward, clutching at the wound. Where the iron had touched, its flesh was smoking and turning gray. "You can't kill me," it snarled. "I am eternal. I am the hunger that has existed since the first human looked into the darkness and felt afraid." "Maybe not," I said, struggling to my feet. "But I can hurt you, and I can make sure you never wear my friend's face again." I advanced on it, the axe head held out in front of me like a talisman. The creature backed away, its confidence evaporating as smoke continued to rise from its wound. "You don't understand," it said, and for the first time, there was something like fear in its voice. "Without me, your friend is just dead. At least this way, part of him continues." "That's not Brian," I said. "That's just you wearing his memories like a costume." I lunged forward and managed to rake the iron across one of its arms. The creature shrieked and stumbled, its form beginning to waver and lose cohesion. "He wanted this," it screamed. "He was tired of fighting, tired of hurting. I gave him peace." "You gave him death," I said, and drove the axe head into its chest. The effect was immediate and devastating. The creature's form began to collapse in on itself, its borrowed flesh melting away like snow in the sun. For just a moment, I thought I saw Brian's real face looking out at me from within the dissolving mass. Not the twisted smile of the creature, but his genuine expression of surprise and gratitude. "Kenny," he said in his real voice, weak but unmistakably him. "Thank you." Then the creature was gone, leaving nothing but a puddle of black ichor that hissed and steamed where it touched the ground. I stood there for a long time, bleeding and exhausted, holding the iron axe head and trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I realized that the forest around me was coming alive again. Insects chirping, small animals rustling through the underbrush, wind sighing through the trees. Whatever unnatural presence had been suppressing the normal sounds of the wilderness was gone. My phone, miraculously, had started working again. It was 4:47 a.m., and I had 3 bars of signal. I called 911 and tried to explain to the dispatcher that I needed help without sounding completely insane. I told them my camping partner had gone missing and I was injured and lost in Hoosier National Forest. The search and rescue team found me 2 hours later, sitting on the old stone foundation and staring at the puddle of what the investigators would later describe as an unknown organic substance. They never did figure out what it was, and I never tried to explain. Brian's body was discovered 3 days later in a ravine about a mile from our campsite. The coroner ruled it an accidental death. He'd apparently fallen while gathering firewood and struck his head on a rock. The timeline suggested he'd died sometime in the early evening, hours before I'd encountered the thing wearing his face. I attended his funeral and helped carry his casket. His ex-wife, Sarah, was there, crying crocodile tears for the cameras, and his kids looked small and lost in their formal clothes. I wanted to tell them that their father had fought something terrible at the end, that he'd found the strength to help me destroy the thing that had taken his place. But how do you explain something like that to children who are already struggling to understand why their daddy isn't coming home anymore? The physical wounds healed within a few weeks. The scars on my back and chest faded to thin white lines. But the psychological damage was deeper and more lasting. I still work as a paramedic. People need help, and I'm good at my job, but I've never gone camping again. I can't stand being in the woods after dark, and even during the day I find myself looking over my shoulder, checking for signs that something is watching me from the shadows between the trees. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Brian's voice calling my name. But I've learned to recognize the difference between memory and something else entirely. Memory has weight and context, the full spectrum of human emotion. The other thing, the voice that sometimes echoes from dark corners or whispers through ventilation grates, is hungry and hollow. All appetite and no soul. I keep that old axe head in my apartment now, cleaned and sharpened and mounted on a new handle. Most people who see it assume it's a decoration, a piece of rustic charm to complement my furniture. They don't know that I sleep with it beside my bed, or that I carry iron nails in my pocket wherever I go. Because I've learned something that most people don't know, something that the old stories tried to teach us before we got too civilized to listen. There are things in the darkness that hunger for more than just flesh. They hunger for identity, for the warmth of human connection, for the weight of memory and love and loss that makes us who we are. And sometimes when people venture too far from the light, when they're broken and desperate and ready to give up, those things answer. The worst part isn't that Brian is dead. People die every day, and as a paramedic, I've made my peace with mortality. The worst part is knowing that something else is out there wearing the memories of everyone who's ever walked into the wilderness and never come back. It's learning their voices, studying their mannerisms, waiting for the next person who's hurting badly enough to listen when it calls their name in the voice of someone they trusted. I think about that sometimes. Late at night when sleep won't come. I think about all the missing person reports that get filed every year, all the people who vanish without a trace in national forests and state parks across the country. Most of them probably have perfectly rational explanations. Accidents, getting lost, exposure to the elements. But some of them, I'm convinced, walked into the woods alone and desperate and met something that promised to take their pain away. And now part of them lives on in that collective hunger, their voices added to the chorus that calls out to the next broken soul who wanders too far from the light. I've considered moving somewhere else, somewhere far from forests and wild places, but wherever I go, I know I'll be listening for Brian's voice in the darkness, waiting for the day when something that learned to be him comes looking for me again. Because I don't think what I destroyed that night was the original. I think it was just one piece of something much larger, something that's been growing and feeding and learning for longer than human memory. And I don't think it's done with me yet. Sometimes I catch my reflection in windows or mirrors and wonder if the face looking back is really mine, or if something else has learned to wear it so perfectly that even I can't tell the difference. It's a paranoid thought, I know, but paranoia is just another word for the survival instinct that kept our ancestors alive when things with teeth and claws ruled the darkness. The thing is, I remember everything that happened that night with perfect clarity. Every word, every sound, every moment of terror. But sometimes I wonder, if something could learn to imitate Brian so perfectly, how would I know if it had learned to imitate me? How would anyone know? That thought keeps me awake most nights, staring at the ceiling and listening for the sound of my own voice calling to me from the darkness outside my window. Because if I ever hear it, if something out there has learned to be Kenneth Young well enough to fool even myself, then I'll know it's time to reach for that iron axe and hope I'm still strong enough to do what needs to be done, even if it means destroying myself to save everyone else from the thing I might have become. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Charles C. Deem Wilderness, deep in the Hoosier National Forest, during the third week of October 2024. I'd been living off-grid for 8 months by then, trying to escape the suffocating weight of my former life in Indianapolis. My ex-wife, Sarah, had taken everything in the divorce, the house, the kids, half my retirement, and I'd reached my breaking point with the corporate grind that had slowly killed my soul over 15 years. So, I'd bought a used pickup truck, some camping gear, and headed south to the most remote wilderness I could find in Indiana. The Deem Wilderness seemed perfect. 37 miles of interconnected trails winding through 13,000 acres of pristine forest, with only a handful of other people crazy enough to venture into its depths during the cooler months. I'd been camping along the Grub Ridge Trail for the past 3 weeks, moving my camp every few days to avoid detection by rangers, surviving off canned goods, stream water, and the occasional fish I managed to catch. October in southern Indiana can be beautiful, but it can also be treacherous. The hardwood forest exploded with reds and golds during the day, but at night, when the temperature dropped into the 30s and the wind picked up, it became a different place entirely. A place where sounds carried strange and far, where shadows moved independently of their sources, and where a man could easily convince himself he wasn't alone. I should have paid attention to those feelings, but grief and anger have a way of making a man ignore his instincts, and I was drowning in both. The first sign that something was wrong came on my second week in the wilderness. I'd been following the Peninsula Trail toward a backcountry campsite when I noticed that my GPS had stopped working. Not just low battery, completely dead, even though I'd charged it that morning. My phone was the same, screen black despite showing a full charge the night before. Even my analog compass was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. I told myself it was interference from the limestone deposits that riddled this part of southern Indiana. The Hoosier National Forest sat atop ancient bedrock that could play havoc with electronics. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal equipment failure. It started with small things, sounds that didn't quite fit, a snapping branch when no wind was blowing, the rustle of leaves being disturbed by something larger than a squirrel but moving too quietly to be a deer. I'd been in the woods long enough to distinguish between the normal percussion of forest life and something else. Something deliberate. Then there were the tracks. I first noticed them on a muddy section of trail near Grub Ridge. They looked almost human at first glance, about the size of a man's bare foot, but the proportions were wrong. The toes were too long, spread too wide, and there were what looked like claw marks at the tips. The stride was also off, sometimes extending 8 or 9 feet between steps, far longer than any human could manage. I photographed them with my phone, but when I tried to review the images later, I found nothing but a screen full of static. Every photo I'd taken in the past week had been corrupted somehow, reduced to random patterns of black and white pixels. That should have been my cue to leave. Any reasonable person would have packed up and headed back to civilization. But I wasn't reasonable. I was a man who'd lost everything and had nowhere else to go. The woods felt like my last refuge, the only place where my failures couldn't follow me. Or so I thought. The temperature began dropping earlier than usual that October. Instead of the mild days and cool nights typical for the season, we were getting hard frosts and daytime highs barely reaching the 40s. The local animals seemed to sense something too. I hadn't seen a deer or even a squirrel in days, though I could sometimes hear them moving through the underbrush. Always at a distance, always fleeing from something. On the Monday before everything went to hell, I was setting up camp near the intersection of two creek beds when I found the first cache. Hidden under a fallen log, wrapped in what looked like deer hide, was a bundle of objects that made my blood run cold. There were bones, small ones from rabbits or squirrels, arranged in a specific pattern. Human teeth, yellowed with age, locks of hair in different colors and textures, tied with sinew. And in the center of it all, a photograph of a family I didn't recognize, their faces carefully scratched out with something sharp. I should have left it alone. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to find another campsite, to get as far from that place as possible. Instead, I found myself picking up the photograph, studying the scratched faces, wondering who these people were and what had happened to them. That night I dreamed about them. In the dream, they were still alive, still whole, sitting around a campfire much like mine. They were laughing and telling stories, roasting marshmallows, enjoying a family camping trip in what looked like the same stretch of forest where I'd made camp. But something was watching them from the tree line. A tall, thin figure that moved wrong, like a marionette with tangled strings. As I watched in horror, the figure began to change, its features shifting and flowing until it looked exactly like the father in the family. Then it walked into their camp, smiling, and they welcomed it as if nothing had changed. Only I could see the real father's body hanging upside down from a tree branch just beyond the reach of their firelight. His throat opened like a second mouth. I woke up screaming. The cache was gone when I checked the next morning. Not moved, gone, as if it had never existed. Even the depression in the earth where it had been hidden was smoothed over, covered with a neat layer of fallen leaves that looked like they'd been undisturbed for years. But I could still smell it, that sweet, cloying scent of decay that had been wrapped up with those bones and teeth. It seemed to cling to everything now, my clothes, my sleeping bag, the inside of my tent. No amount of fresh air could wash it away. On the Tuesday night when everything began to unravel, I was camped about 2 miles east of the main Grub Ridge Trail, near a small creek that meandered through a narrow valley thick with ancient oaks and maples. I'd chosen the spot because it was sheltered from the wind and had good access to water, but as darkness fell, I realized I'd also chosen a place where the canopy was so thick that almost no moonlight penetrated to the forest floor. The darkness here was different from anything I'd experienced. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence unto itself, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin like damp fabric. My camp stove provided the only illumination, a small blue flame that seemed pathetically inadequate against the weight of the surrounding blackness. I was heating a can of beans over my small camp stove when I heard it for the first time, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was somewhere between a whistle and a call, high-pitched and wavering, lasting maybe 10 seconds before trailing off into silence. But there was something underneath it, something that my conscious mind didn't want to acknowledge. It sounded almost like a voice trying to form words, syllables being stretched and twisted into unnatural shapes. The call came from the darkness beyond my small circle of light, maybe 100 yards away. But sound carries strangely in the forest at night, and I couldn't be sure of the direction or distance. It could have been a mile away or just beyond the trees that marked the edge of my vision. I sat motionless for several minutes, beans forgotten, listening to the profound silence that had fallen over the forest. It was as if every living thing had suddenly gone into hiding, leaving me utterly alone with whatever had made that sound. Even the creek seemed to have muted its gentle babbling, as if afraid to draw attention to itself. Then I heard something that made the hair on my arms stand up, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps circling my camp. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the heavy, crashing progress of a bear, but something bipedal, something that was placing each foot carefully, testing the ground before committing its weight. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I could feel it there, a presence looming just outside the reach of my firelight. My breathing became shallow and rapid, and I had to resist the overwhelming urge to turn around. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming at me not to look, that whatever was behind me was something I didn't want to see, but I could hear it breathing. The sound was wet and labored, like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to draw air. Each exhale was accompanied by a soft whistling sound, as if the breath was escaping through holes it shouldn't be able to escape through, and underneath it all was a smell, sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. My hand crept slowly toward my flashlight, fingers trembling as they closed around the metal cylinder. I knew I had to look, had to see what was behind me, but every instinct was telling me that turning around would be the worst mistake of my life. The breathing stopped. In that moment of absolute silence, I spun around and triggered my flashlight, the beam sweeping across the space behind my camp. For just an instant, I saw something that shouldn't exist. A tall, impossibly thin figure standing among the trees, its limbs too long and jointed in too many places. Its face was a pale oval in the darkness, featureless except for two black holes where eyes should be. Then the light flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. I fumbled frantically with the flashlight, slapping the side, twisting the head, pressing the button over and over. Nothing. The batteries had been fresh that morning, but now the light was completely dead. I tried my backup flashlight, then my phone's flashlight function. All dead, despite showing full charge indicators earlier. In the absolute darkness, I heard the voice for the first time. Kenneth. It was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly through the still air. Kenneth Young. My heart hammered against my rib cage. Nobody knew I was here. I told no one where I was going, had deliberately avoided the ranger stations and maintained campsites. For weeks, I'd been completely off the grid, invisible to the world I'd left behind. Kenneth. The voice came again, closer now. And there was something familiar about it. Something that made my stomach turn with recognition. It sounded like my father, dead for 12 years now, calling me in for dinner when I was 8 years old. But this wasn't my father. My father had never possessed the cold, hollow quality that made this voice sound like it was coming from the bottom of a well. And my father had never known the things this voice began to whisper from the darkness. I know why you're here, son. I know about the pills you counted out on your kitchen table. I know about the bridge. I know about the rope in your closet. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice continued, now coming from multiple directions at once. I know about the life insurance policy. I know you thought Sarah and the kids would be better off without you. I know about the note you wrote and tore up. I know about the night you sat in your car in the garage with the engine running. These were my deepest secrets, the dark thoughts I'd never shared with anyone. Not Sarah, not my therapist, not even myself most of the time. How could it know? The voices multiplied, and I began to recognize more of them. My mother, worried and loving. Kenny, honey, what are you doing out here all alone? My daughter Emma, confused and hurt. Daddy, why don't you live with us anymore? My son Michael, angry in the way only an 8-year-old can be. You promised you'd teach me to ride my bike. But underneath each familiar voice was that same hollow, echoing quality, as if something was trying to mimic human speech but couldn't quite get the resonance right. I grabbed my camp stove and held it up like a torch. The small blue flame provided barely any light, but it was enough to see that I was no longer alone in my camp. Shapes moved at the very edge of the flame's reach. Tall, thin figures that swayed slightly as if they were trees bending in a wind that only they could feel. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I have a weapon." The shapes stopped moving and the voices fell silent. Then, slowly, one of them stepped into the light. It looked like me. Same height, same build, same receding hairline and the scar on my chin from a childhood fall. But the proportions were slightly off, as if someone had tried to recreate me from memory and gotten some of the details wrong. The arms were too long, hanging past where they should. The eyes were set too far apart and they reflected the flame like an animal's would. When it smiled, I could see too many teeth, all of them sharp. "Hello, Kenneth," it said in my own voice. "I've been waiting to meet you." Behind it, more figures stepped into the light. All of them looked like people I knew. Sarah, Emma, Michael, my parents, my brother, colleagues from work. But all of them were wrong in subtle ways that made my skin crawl. They formed a loose circle around my camp, swaying gently, their eyes never leaving me. "Who are you?" I whispered. The thing that looked like me tilted its head, studying me with those two bright eyes. "We're what you left behind," it said. "All the pieces of yourself that you've been discarding over the years. All the guilt, the shame, the self-hatred. You thought you could run away from us, but we followed you here." The Sarah thing spoke next, and its voice was perfectly pitched to sound like my ex-wife when she was disappointed. "You always ran away when things got difficult, Kenneth. Remember when Emma was sick with pneumonia? You worked late every night that week rather than deal with a crying child." The Michael thing chimed in. "And when I broke my arm falling off my scooter, you were too busy with your conference call to drive me to the hospital." One by one, they began reciting my failures, my shortcomings, my moments of weakness. Every harsh word I'd spoken in anger, every promise I'd broken, every time I'd chosen work over family or comfort over responsibility. They had perfect recall of every mistake I'd made, every person I'd hurt, every opportunity I'd wasted. As they spoke, they began to change. The human facades started slipping, revealing something underneath that was hungry and ancient and utterly without mercy. Their skin became translucent, showing dark shapes moving beneath like parasites. Their faces elongated, jaws unhinging to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Their fingers stretched into claws that clicked together in a sound like breaking bones. But the worst part was that their voices never changed. They continued speaking in the familiar tones of my loved ones, even as their bodies transformed into nightmares. "You wanted to disappear," the Kenneth thing said, its voice now echoing strangely. "You wanted to become nothing. We can help with that." They began moving closer, the circle tightening around me. I backed toward the creek, holding my camp stove in front of me like a shield, but I knew the tiny flame wouldn't protect me from these things. That's when I noticed something odd. Where my fire had been burning for the past hour, the ground was completely barren, not just of vegetation, but of anything. The earth itself looked scorched and lifeless, as if something had been feeding on the very essence of the soil. I looked at my hands holding the camp stove and realized they looked paler than they should, almost translucent in the blue light. When I touched my face, my skin felt cold and somehow less substantial than it had that morning. They weren't just tormenting me. They were feeding on me, slowly draining away whatever it was that made me human, that made me real. "What do you want?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. The circle of creatures paused in their approach, and for a moment, they looked almost human again. The Kenneth thing smiled, and this time the expression was genuinely warm, almost loving. "To go home," it said simply. "To be Kenneth Young. To have a life, a family, a purpose. To be real." That's when I understood the true horror of my situation. These weren't just monsters wearing familiar faces. They were vessels, empty shells that wanted to be filled with human life. One of them would take my place, would return to Indianapolis wearing my face and carrying my memories. It would go back to Sarah and try to win her back, would hug my children with arms that had never really held them, would live my life better than I ever had, and I would simply stop existing. The thought should have terrified me, but instead it brought a strange sort of clarity. For months, I'd been running from my responsibilities, wallowing in self-pity and guilt. I'd convinced myself that everyone would be better off without me, that I was nothing but a burden to the people I loved. But looking at these creatures, these hungry, hollow things that wanted nothing more than to wear my life like a stolen coat, I realized something crucial. My life was mine. Flawed and damaged as it was, it belonged to me, and I wasn't ready to give it up. "No," I said, and the words seemed to surprise them. The circle of creatures paused, their inhuman features registering something like confusion. The Kenneth thing stepped closer, its form shifting slightly as it moved. "You don't understand," it said, and now its voice carried undertones of something ancient and hungry. "You're already dying, Kenneth. We can smell it on you. The despair, the self-hatred, the emptiness. You've been feeding us for weeks without even knowing it. Every moment of doubt, every flash of guilt, every thought of worthlessness has made us stronger." It gestured to the scorched earth around my camp. "Look around you. Look what your presence has done to this place. You're like a poison, Kenneth. Everywhere you go, life withers and dies. Your marriage, your relationship with your children, and now this forest. You destroy everything you touch." The words hit me like physical blows because they contained enough truth to hurt. I had been poison to my family, had let my depression and self-absorption drive wedges between me and everyone I cared about. But as I looked at the blackened ground, I realized something else. "You're wrong," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I didn't do this. You did." The Kenneth thing's smile faltered slightly. "You've been feeding on me," I continued, understanding flooding through me. "All those times I felt worthless, all those moments when I wanted to disappear, that wasn't entirely me. That was you, whispering in my ear, making everything seem hopeless. You're parasites." The creatures began to shift nervously, their human disguises slipping further. The Sarah thing's face elongated into something more canine, while the Emma thing's eyes multiplied until it had 6 or 7, all of them black and reflecting my camp stove's flame. "We offer you peace," the Kenneth thing said, its voice becoming less human with each word. "We offer you an end to suffering. No more guilt, no more failure, no more pain. Just nothing." But that's not peace, I realized aloud. That's just giving up. And I've been giving up for too long. I thought about my children then. Really thought about them for the first time in months. Emma, 11 years old and passionate about horses, who still sent me text messages even though I rarely responded. Michael, 8, who had drawn me a picture for Father's Day that I'd barely glanced at before stuffing it in a drawer. They deserved better than an absent father, but they also deserved better than a hungry imposter wearing their father's face. The realization gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my emergency whistle, a simple metal tube that I'd carried for years but never used. As my fingers closed around it, the creatures seemed to sense the change in my demeanor. Their circle began to tighten again, but this time there was urgency in their movements, as if they knew their window of opportunity was closing. "You can't fight what you are," the Kenneth thing hissed, its face now more skull than flesh. "You can't escape your own nature." "Maybe not," I said, raising the whistle to my lips, "but I can choose what to do about it." I blew as hard as I could. The sound that emerged was impossibly loud, cutting through the oppressive silence of the forest like a blade. But it wasn't just the volume that affected the creatures. It was something else, something pure and defiant that seemed to cause them physical pain. They recoiled as if struck, their forms wavering like heat shimmer. The sound seemed to strip away their stolen faces, revealing the hungry void underneath. They were barely recognizable as having ever been human-shaped, just writhing masses of shadow and want, held together by their own desperate hunger. But the whistle's effects went beyond just repelling them. As the note sustained, I could feel something changing in the forest around us. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me for weeks began to lift. The dead earth around my camp started to show tiny green shoots pushing through the blackened soil. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the tentative call of an owl, then another, as if the natural world was slowly coming back to life. The creatures were fighting to maintain their forms, but they were losing the battle. The Kenneth thing made one last desperate attempt to reach me, its clawed hands stretching toward my throat, but as my whistle's note reached a crescendo, it simply dispersed. Like smoke in a strong wind, it scattered and was gone. The others followed quickly, their shapes breaking apart and dissolving into the darkness they'd emerged from. Within moments, I was alone again. Truly alone for the first time in weeks. The forest was different now. The malevolent presence that had been lurking at the edges of my consciousness was gone, and in its absence, I could hear the normal sounds of night returning. Crickets began their chorus, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and the creek resumed its peaceful babbling. My flashlight mysteriously began working again. The beam was steady and bright, illuminating a campsite that looked completely normal. The scorched earth was green again, covered with the thick carpet of fallen leaves typical for this time of year. My equipment was exactly where I'd left it, and my camp stove was still burning cheerfully. But I was different too. The crushing weight of despair that had been my constant companion for months was gone, replaced by something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was. Hope. I spent the rest of the night awake, not from fear, but from a kind of electric energy that coursed through my veins. As dawn broke over the Hoosier National Forest, painting the autumn leaves in brilliant shades of gold and red, I began breaking down my camp for the last time. I'd come to these woods to disappear, to fade away from a life that felt too heavy to carry. But somewhere in the darkness, I'd found something worth fighting for. Myself. Not the perfect version of myself that I'd always thought I should be, but the flawed, struggling human version that was the only one I actually had. The hike back to civilization took most of the day. My GPS worked perfectly now, guiding me along the peninsula trail to the Hardin Ridge Recreation Area, where I'd left my truck in what felt like a lifetime ago. The vehicle started immediately, and as I drove through the winding roads of the National Forest, I caught glimpses of deer through the trees, the first wildlife I'd seen in weeks. I drove north toward Bloomington, but instead of heading to a motel, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. I needed to make a phone call, and I needed to do it while my resolve was still strong. Sarah answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep and worry. "Kenneth, is that you? It's 6 a.m. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I've been lost for a while, but I think I'm ready to find my way back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Where are you?" "Bloomington. I was wondering, could I see the kids? Not to move back in or anything like that. I know I have a lot of work to do before I earn that right, but I'd like to start trying to be their father again. Their real father." Another pause, and then Sarah's voice, softer now. "They miss you, Kenneth. They've been asking about you." "I miss them too," I said, and felt tears coming for the first time in months. "I miss them so much it hurts, and I'm tired of running from that hurt." "Come home," she said simply. "We'll figure it out from there." I ended the call and sat in my truck for a long time, watching the sun rise over the hills of southern Indiana. In a few hours, I would drive north to Indianapolis and begin the long process of rebuilding my life. I would apologize to my children for the father I'd been and start learning how to be the father they deserved. I would find a therapist, get proper treatment for my depression, and slowly work to earn back the trust I'd thrown away. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and struggles, days when the old darkness tried to creep back in. But I'd learned something important in those woods. Even the deepest darkness could be fought if you had the courage to make some noise. As I pulled out of the diner parking lot and headed north toward home, I kept my emergency whistle on the dashboard where I could see it. Just a reminder that sometimes when everything seems lost, the smallest act of defiance can save your life. And in the rearview mirror, the Hoosier National Forest grew smaller and smaller until it was just a green line on the horizon. But I knew that somewhere in those woods, something was still waiting for the next lost soul to stumble into its domain. I hoped they would find the strength to blow their whistle and walk away. Because whatever promises the darkness makes, whatever easy escapes it offers, they're never worth the price it demands. Some hungers, I've learned, are better left unfed. The human heart, broken as it might be, is still worth fighting for. Wasn't nothing. I was a flawed human being with people who still cared about me, and that was enough. When Sarah arrived, she took one look at me and wrapped me in a hug that lasted a long time. She didn't ask what had happened in the woods, and I didn't volunteer the information. Some experiences are too strange, too personal, to share. I never went back to the Deem Wilderness. I sold my camping gear and used the money for a security deposit on a small apartment in Bloomington. I found work at a hardware store, started therapy to deal with my depression, and began the slow process of rebuilding my relationship with my children. It's been 8 months now since that night in the forest. I've had nightmares, of course, and there are times when I catch sight of my reflection in a mirror and have to look twice to make sure it's really me looking back. But I'm alive. I'm human, and I'm present for the people who matter. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd given in, if I'd let those things take my place. Would anyone have noticed the difference? Would Sarah have realized that the man who came back wasn't really me? Would my children have grown up with something that only pretended to love them? I suppose I'll never know, but I do know this. The hunger that had been eating me alive for years, the emptiness that had driven me into those woods in the first place, is gone. Whatever those creatures were, they took that with them when they faded away. In their place is something I'd almost forgotten existed: hope. The darkness still scares me sometimes. I sleep with a nightlight now, keep a flashlight on my nightstand, and I've never been camping since. But I'm not running anymore. I've learned that you can't escape yourself by fleeing into the wilderness. The only way out is through, one day at a time, one choice at a time. And if something is still out there in the Deem Wilderness, waiting for the next broken soul to stumble into its domain, I hope they find the strength to blow their whistle and walk away. Because whatever promises the darkness makes, whatever easy escapes it offers, they're never worth the price it demands. Some hungers, I've learned, are better left unfed. The human heart, broken as it might be, is still worth fighting for.